Ark Raiders hides 196 Easter eggs across its world, buried deep inside crumbling walls, machine designs, audio files, and forgotten environments. And the vast majority of players have walked right past every single one without ever once stopping to look. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So I put this video together because Ark Raiders kept pulling at me in a way most games don't. I play a lot of extraction shooters, and most of them tell their stories through cutscenes or quest text. Ark Raiders does something different. It hides its story in the world itself, and the more I dug, the more I found details that clearly weren't accidents. When I was assembling this video, I made a specific choice to group these Easter eggs by what they seem to be about, rather than where you find them, because a lot of them connect to each other in ways that only become clear when you see them in sequence. I also excluded anything that felt like a texture glitch or an engine artifact, keeping only what looks genuinely intentional. Everything I talk about here is my interpretation. The developers haven't confirmed most of this, and I want to be upfront about that. With that said, let's get into it. Also, don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying the video. It genuinely helps more than you might think. Chapter 1. The Ruins. We play. And let's start with something most players never think about, which is the environment itself. The ruins in Ark Raiders are not just backdrop. They are a graveyard of a world that was alive, functioning, and completely unaware of what was coming. The developers at Embark Studios built these spaces with a level of detail that goes way beyond what gameplay requires. And buried inside that detail are 14 Easter eggs that most people never notice, each one telling you something specific about who lived here and what happened to them. The first one shows up in what most players call Zone 7, though the internal map label is a little different. If you look up at the large faded billboard on the eastern corner of the main approach road, you can see the ghost of a printed advertisement. Most of the colour has bleached out, but the shape of an airplane is still there, along with a stylized wing logo that appears to be for a Pre-ark airline carrier. The font and logo style place this firmly in the period immediately before the invasion, and the destination, printed below the plane, partially obscured by rust damage, seems to read a coastal city name. Whether the developers chose that specific city on purpose is hard to say, but given how many other details in this game are clearly deliberate, it points toward this being intentional environmental storytelling about where this community was connected to before everything changed. The second Easter egg is easy to miss because it is small and low to the ground. Near the old residential cluster in the northern section of the same zone, there is a rusted metal playground. Most players glance at it and keep moving, but if you crouch down and look at the frame structure of the main climbing unit, you can see that the design matches a specific style of modular playground equipment that was common in the 1980s and early 1990s. The welds, the tube diameter, the way the slide is mounted, all of it suggests the developers modelled this from a specific reference. This playground did not come from a generic asset library. It was designed to look like something real, and that suggests this is meant to place the neighbourhood's history at a specific point in time, perhaps meaning the adults who lived here when the Ark arrived had grown up with equipment like this in their own childhoods. The third Easter egg is a half-buried school bus visible at the edge of a collapsed overpass. The bus is mostly underground, pushed there by debris, but its roof is still accessible and the side windows are intact. If you go up to the window and look inside, you can see that the seat numbers are still stenciled above each row. They run from 1 to 24, which is a reasonable number for a standard school bus. But the detail that stands out is that only seats 1 through 9 on the right side have small backpacks or lunch boxes still sitting on them. The left side is completely empty. One possible reading of this is that the bus was in the middle of a pickup route when the Ark attack began, meaning the driver had already collected students from one side of the route before whatever happened. The deliberate asymmetry feels too specific to be accidental. The fourth Easter egg is a church visible near the centre of one of the larger urban zones. The structure is heavily damaged, with much of the roof collapsed and the windows blown out. But the cross on the facade is still partially standing, tilted at roughly a 40-degree angle. What makes this interesting is the tilt direction. It leans forward toward the street, which is the direction that the arc impact pattern in this zone would have come from based on the debris scattered around the building. One possible reading is that the developers deliberately oriented this detail to be consistent with the physics of the arc arrival in this area. The cross fell forward because that is the direction the initial shockwave came from. It is a small thing, but it suggests somebody put genuine thought into how this specific building would have responded to this specific event. The fifth Easter egg is one that players have spotted before, but the full implication of it tends to get overlooked. In 3 separate locations across the main map zones, you can find physical wall calendars. All 3 are frozen on dates. Now, the interesting part is that the dates are not all the same. They span a period of about 4 days. This suggests that the arc arrival did not happen in a single moment, but rather unfolded over several days of escalating events, with different locations being affected at different times. The earliest date appears in the zone closest to what seems to be an industrial area. The latest appears in a more central residential zone. If this is intentional, it points toward the arc invasion, beginning on the periphery and working inward, which matches some of the environmental damage patterns elsewhere in the game. The sixth Easter egg involves the grocery stores scattered throughout the zones. These are largely picked clean, as you would expect, but some of the shelves still have items on them, and those items have brand labels. The labels are clearly fictional, but they are designed to look close to real brands without actually being them. What makes this an Easter egg rather than just a generic design choice is the level of specificity. The fictional brand for a canned soup product has a label design, a logo colour scheme, and even a small slogan printed at the bottom that reads something close to a real phrase. The developers clearly referenced real packaging when making these, and in at least one case the fictional brand name appears to be a gentle anagram of a real brand. Whether this is intentional humour or a way of avoiding trademark issues while still making the world feel grounded is up for debate, but either way it is a detail that rewards a close look. The seventh Easter egg is at the old movie theatre visible in the commercial district of one zone. The marquee out front still has letters on it, though several have fallen. What remains spells out a partial title that, with a little imagination, could be reconstructed. Players have attempted to figure out the full title, and one reconstruction that has gained traction in the community reads as something close to a title that sounds like an old action film. The interesting detail here is not the title itself, but the letterform style, which suggests the theatre was displaying a film that was perhaps already on its extended run, not a new release. The implication being that this theatre had been playing this film for weeks or months before the invasion, which suggests a world that was, at least publicly, not in emergency mode, even as the arc arrival was perhaps already beginning. The eighth Easter egg is genuinely unsettling once you notice it. In the ruined streets of one of the outer zones, there is an overturned ambulance. This is not unusual. There are crashed vehicles everywhere. But if you climb on top of the ambulance and look through the rear window, you can see inside the cargo area. The gurney is still deployed, and there is a figure still strapped to it. The figure is not a monster or an enemy. It is just a still human-shaped form in what appears to be a patient gown, still secured by the restraint straps. The medkit above the gurney is still mounted. The defibrillator is still in its holder. Whatever emergency this ambulance was responding to, it never delivered its patient. The ambulance tipped mid-transit. This detail serves no gameplay function. It is purely there to tell a story about a specific person who did not make it, and it is rendered with enough care that you get the impression somebody spent time on it. The 9th Easter egg is about geography. In several locations, street signs are still readable on damaged poles. The street names are fictional, but the directional arrows on intersection signs point in directions that are geographically consistent with each other. If you trace them on the map, they form a navigable network that suggests the zone was modelled after a real urban grid. More specifically, the scale of the blocks, the typical width of the streets, and the placement of commercial versus residential streets all match the pattern of a mid-sized North American city. Whether this was modelled on a specific real city is unclear, but the consistency of the geography feels like the work of someone who is referencing something real rather than building an abstract fictional city. The 10th Easter egg is one of the few that involves sport. In one of the outer zones, there is a basketball court with a rusted scoreboard still mounted on the wall of an adjacent building. The scoreboard is partially visible, and the numbers that remain show a game that was close with one team ahead by a small margin. The clock display below the score appears to show time remaining rather than elapsed time, though the specific digits are hard to read without getting very close. What makes this interesting is that this detail implies the game was interrupted mid-play, probably in the fourth quarter if we assume standard game structure. Somebody's game ended mid-possession. The net on one of the hoops is still intact, though frayed, which means the court was maintained until fairly recently before the invasion. The 11th Easter egg is at a community swimming pool visible in one of the residential zones. The pool itself is drained and partially filled with debris, but at the bottom of the pool you can see items that settled there when the water was still present. There is a pair of goggles, a foam kickboard, and what appears to be a waterproof phone case. These items did not fall in during the invasion. They sank to the bottom before the pool drained, meaning they were left in the water during what would have been a normal swimming session. The pool has tile lane markers still visible, and the racing start blocks at the deep end are still bolted in place. This is someone's community pool on a normal afternoon, frozen exactly where it was. The 12th Easter egg is in a diner. The diner's interior is accessible through a broken side window in one zone, and if you go inside and look at the counter, several of the stools still have place settings at them. But more specifically, 2 of the counter spots have half-eaten meals still on the plates. The food is long decayed and visually represented as dried remnants, but the portion sizes on each plate are different. One plate has most of its meal gone, the other looks barely touched. This reads like 2 people eating together, one nearly finished and one who had barely started, when something interrupted them. They left without clearing their plates, without taking their belongings, and without paying. There is a check sitting on the counter between the 2 spots. It has been there since. The 13th Easter egg involves a wedding venue. In one zone there is a banquet hall with large windows, and through those windows or through the collapsed section of the wall, you can see inside. The interior is set up for a reception that was never completed. Tables are dressed with centerpieces that are now dried and dusty. A wedding cake stand is still centered on a head table, though the cake itself has long since collapsed. The chairs on one side of the room are pushed out from the tables in a pattern suggesting people were already seated. The chairs on the other side are still tucked in. The bar area in the corner has open bottles still on the counter. The event was in progress. The guests were there. Something stopped it. The 14th Easter egg in this chapter involves power lines, which is an unusual thing to pay attention to in any game. But in Ark Raiders, the power lines in one specific zone are arranged in a way that, if you get high enough to see them from above, forms a readable pattern. Players have reached the necessary elevation using various environmental climbing routes, and the consensus from people who have done it is that the arrangement of poles and the drape of the cables between them forms letters when viewed from directly above. The letters are not perfectly formed. They are approximated by the natural catenary curve of the cables, but the pattern is too deliberate to be random. What the letters spell has been debated, but the most common reading is a short word that could be a name, a date, or a designation. The developers clearly had to position every pole in that zone intentionally for this to work, which means it was a deliberate choice made at the level of map design. That covers the 14 environmental Easter eggs in this first chapter. The thing that connects all of them is that none of them are meant to advance gameplay. None of them give you loot or information that helps you survive. They are purely narrative details placed for the player who chooses to slow down and actually look at the world they're moving through. Ark Raiders is asking you to notice things, and when you do, the picture it builds is very specific. This was not an abstract apocalypse. It was a specific Tuesday afternoon in a specific city, and then something happened, and everyone in the middle of their normal life did not get to finish it. The environmental storytelling in Ark Raiders operates on a principle that the game's designers have talked about in a general sense in interviews, which is that the world should feel inhabited before it felt abandoned. Every detail we just went through is an example of that principle in action. The airplane billboard tells you this city had an airport with active flight routes. The school bus tells you there were children being picked up from school. The ambulance tells you there was still a functioning emergency services network. Taken together, they describe a civilization that was operating normally up until the moment it wasn't. What makes the environmental Easter eggs interesting from a lore perspective is what they don't show. There are no signs of preparation for the Ark arrival in any of these locations. No boarding up of windows, no stockpiling of supplies in basements, no evacuation notices on walls. Whatever the Ark arrival was, it either came without warning or with warnings that were not believed. The wedding venue is perhaps the clearest example of this. People planned a wedding reception for a specific date. They decorated the venue, ordered a cake, sent invitations, and showed up. None of them acted as if they expected their evening to end the way it did. The playground Easter egg connects to something the game suggests elsewhere about the timeline of the Ark world. If the playground equipment is modelled on late 1980s designs, and if we assume this is meant to suggest when the neighbourhood was built, or when that equipment was installed, then the adults in this area when the Ark arrived were likely in their 30s or 40s. Old enough to have known the world before. Old enough to have children of their own, who would have been school age. The school bus Easter egg then connects back to the playground Easter egg in a quiet, understated way. These details are not labelled or called out. They just exist, side by side in the same zone, waiting for someone to make the connection. The calendar Easter egg in particular points towards something that the game's lore suggests, but never directly states, which is that the Ark arrival was not a single moment. The 4-day spread across the 3 calendars in different locations suggests that whatever the Ark machines were doing when they first arrived, they did it gradually. The outer zones were hit first, the central residential zones were hit last. This matters because it raises a question about awareness. Did people in the central zones know what was happening on the outskirts? Did they have 4 days of warning and choose not to act? Or was information suppressed or simply not moving fast enough? The game does not answer this, but the calendars are clearly arranged to ask it. One more thing about the grocery store Easter egg before we move on. The fictional brand names in Ark Raiders are not randomly generated. They follow an internal logic that several players and data miners have noted. The naming conventions for the fictional brands seem to follow regional patterns, with some brands having names that sound Scandinavian, some that sound distinctly North American, and some that blend both. Given that Embark Studios is a Swedish developer, the Scandinavian-sounding brand names, in particular, feel like quiet nods to the studio's own cultural context, embedded in a world that otherwise presents as broadly North American in its visual design. It is a small thing, but it adds a layer to the grocery store Easter egg that makes it richer than it first appears. The movie theatre Easter egg connects to a larger pattern in the game's approach to cultural references. Ark Raiders does not use real film titles or real brand names. Instead, it creates fictional versions that are close enough to feel real, but different enough to be original. This is a consistent design philosophy, and it suggests the developers wanted the world to feel like ours without being exactly ours. The movie theatre title, the grocery brands, the airline logo on the billboard, all of these things point toward a world that diverged from our own at some point, perhaps recently, perhaps long ago, and has its own version of culture and commerce. The Ark invasion did not happen to our world exactly. It happened to a world adjacent to ours, similar enough to feel familiar, but distinct enough to be its own thing. The swimming pool Easter egg raises a question about what the Ark machine's initial behaviour was, specifically about how they treated human survivors. The items at the bottom of the drained pool suggest they sank before the pool was drained. If the pool drained due to infrastructure failure, and if infrastructure failed quickly, then whoever was swimming in that pool had very little time between the Ark arrival and the loss of basic services. The pool would have drained as water treatment systems failed and maintenance stopped. The goggles and the kickboard sat at the bottom as the water dropped around them and eventually disappeared. The pool itself became a time capsule for the last normal afternoon its users ever had. The diner Easter egg connects to something that the game's designers have been thoughtful about, which is the class dynamics of survival. The diner is in a commercial district, not a residential one. The people eating there were likely not residents of that immediate area. They might have been workers on a lunch break, or travellers, or just people passing through. Two people sat at a counter and ate a meal together, and the difference in how much they had eaten tells you something about the difference in their situations. One person was nearly done. The other had barely started. Did they stay together? Did they get separated? The diner does not tell you. It just shows you the plates and lets you wonder. The wedding venue Easter egg is interesting for what it implies about how Ark Raiders positions human connection. In a game fundamentally about survival and extraction, the developers went out of their way to render a wedding reception in enough detail to feel real. The centerpieces, the cake stand, the open bar, these details did not need to exist. The venue could have been a generic banquet hall with generic furniture. Instead, it is a specific event, frozen in its most celebratory moment, interrupted by something catastrophic. The developers are making a point about what was lost. Not just infrastructure, not just civilization, but the specific small joys that made civilization worth having. The Powerline Easter egg is the most technically impressive of the environmental group because it required planning at a very early stage of map design. The position of every power pole in that zone had to be deliberate, and the spacing and direction of the cable runs had to be calculated to produce the aerial view that players have discovered. This is not something that could have happened by accident. Somebody sat down with the map layout and worked out the pole positions to produce a specific visual result from above. The fact that this is almost never seen by players during normal gameplay, because reaching the necessary elevation requires deliberate effort and specific knowledge, makes it feel like a genuine hidden message. The developers made something that the vast majority of players will never see, simply because they wanted it to be there. Before we move to the next chapter, let's just sit with the overall picture that these 14 Easter eggs paint: a functioning city, normal life in progress, a school bus on its morning route, a wedding reception underway, a basketball game in its final minutes, a diner at lunch service, and then nothing. The calendars freeze, the meals go uneaten, the playground goes unplayed on. Ark Raiders is asking you to grieve the world before it asks you to survive in it. That is an unusual thing for an extraction shooter to do, and it is one of the reasons this game's environmental design deserves attention. Chapter 2: The Ark Machine's Hidden Design. Details. The Ark Machines are the central threat of the game, and players spend most of their time trying to avoid or destroy them. But the machines themselves are loaded with hidden details that most people never look for because they're too busy trying to stay alive. This chapter covers 14 Easter eggs embedded in the Ark machine designs, from serial numbers to behavioral patterns to physical details on the chassis that point toward a larger and stranger story about what the Arks actually are. The 15th Easter egg starts with the Ark unit's serial numbers. Every Ark unit in the game has a serial number stamped on its chassis, though you need to be close and the unit needs to be disabled or destroyed for you to read it safely. The serial numbers are not random. They follow a consistent format that, when you decode the structure of it, appears to encode a manufacturing date and a batch identifier. Players have catalogued hundreds of these numbers, and the range of manufacturing dates that emerge from the decoded serials spans a period of roughly 2 decades. The earliest units appear to have been manufactured, or at least designated, long before the in-game Ark invasion began. This is one of the details that most directly suggests the Ark machines have a history that predates their appearance on Earth. The 16th Easter egg involves the visual sensors on certain Ark machine types. The Stalker-class Ark units have a cluster of optical sensors arranged in a roughly circular pattern on their head assembly. Under normal combat conditions, these sensors pulse with light as the unit tracks targets. But if you observe a Stalker that has not yet detected you in its ambient patrol state, the pulsing pattern of those sensors is not random. It repeats in a consistent cycle that players have timed and documented. When that cycle is interpreted as a form of binary or Morse code, it produces a repeating short sequence that some players have transcribed. The transcription is debated, but one reading of it produces a sequence that matches a known distress code. Whether the developers intended this as a distress signal, a designation code, or something else is unclear, but the deliberate non-randomness of the pattern is hard to explain away. The 17th Easter egg is about the chassis markings that appear on Ark units beyond their serial numbers. On several Ark unit types, particularly on the heavier Assault class machines, there are what appear to be engraved or etched symbols on the outer plating. These are distinct from the serial number stamps and from any visible damage. They appear to be original features of the machine's construction. Several of these symbols have been catalogued by players and compared against known symbol sets. Some resemble mathematical notation, some resemble navigational markers, some do not resemble anything in any known human reference system. The ones that look like mathematical notation are particularly interesting because they appear near the Ark machine's primary joint systems, almost like engineering annotations marking load-bearing points. This could suggest that the machines were designed with human-readable technical documentation in mind, which raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. The 18th Easter egg is an audio one that fits better here than in the audio chapter, because it is specific to Ark machine behavior. If you record the ambient sound produced by one of the Crawler-class Ark units during its active patrol, and then apply audio processing to slow it down significantly, the resulting sound has a quality that a lot of people who have done this describe as unsettling. The consensus among players who have experimented with this is that the slowed audio has a tonal quality that resembles a human child's voice, not in any recognizable linguistic pattern, but in the specific frequency range and rhythmic cadence that human children's speech tends to occupy. Whether this is intentional audio design or a coincidence of how the game's audio engine processes the mechanical sounds is genuinely difficult to say, but it has been noted by enough independent players that it is hard to dismiss. The 19th Easter egg is about spawn behavior. Certain Ark unit types appear to have location preferences that go beyond simple patrol routes. Specifically, some Ark units appear almost exclusively near certain types of locations. The Stalker-class Ark appears disproportionately near locations that have human personal items of a specific kind, particularly near children's items, school-related spaces, and residential bedrooms. This could be a coincidence of patrol route design, but it could also be a deliberate choice by the developers to suggest that certain Ark unit types are associated with certain kinds of human spaces. Players have mapped this correlation across multiple play sessions, and it holds up with enough consistency to be worth noting. The 20th Easter egg involves the wear patterns on Ark machine chassis. Ark machines show damage and wear, which is expected in a game like this. But some of the wear on certain Ark units appears to have been pre-applied by the developers rather than generated by in-game combat. You can tell the difference because pre-applied wear is identical across every instance of that unit type, while combat damage is variable. The pre-applied wear on several Ark unit types suggests these machines have been active for a long time. The wear is specifically concentrated on joints, on the undersides of feet, and on the edges of the machine's primary sensors, which are exactly the places that would show the most use over extended active deployment. If the wear is meant to be realistic, it points toward these machines having been operating continuously for years before players encounter them. The 21st Easter egg is about movement. The Stalker-class Ark unit moves in a way that has been described as wolf-like, and this is not just a casual impression. Players have tracked and documented the Stalker's movement patterns across multiple sessions and compared them to documented wolfpack movement behavior. The comparison holds in several specific ways. Stalker units, when in groups, tend to move in a loose formation, with one unit slightly ahead of the others. They alternate who leads the formation over time. They flank from different directions when pressing an attack. These are not arbitrary AI behaviors. They are recognizable from wildlife documentation on pack hunting behavior. One possible reading is that the developers specifically modeled the Stalker's AI on wolfpack movement, which is interesting both as a design detail and as a lore detail, because it raises the question of how a machine from beyond Earth would have developed behavior that mirrors a specifically Earth-native predator. The 22nd Easter egg connects to the 21st. The Stalker's footstep audio changes rhythm in certain zones. Specifically, in zones that are near water sources, the Stalker's footstep cadence is slightly slower. In zones with open sightlines, its cadence is faster and more even. Players have documented this, and it appears to be a consistent design choice rather than a technical glitch. This adaptive audio behavior mirrors the way real predatory animals adjust their movement speed to terrain. In dense or wet terrain, animals slow their footfalls to reduce noise and maintain grip. In open terrain, they move more confidently and quickly. The fact that the Stalker's audio reflects this dynamic suggests that whoever designed the Stalker's movement behavior was thinking about naturalistic animal movement in significant detail. The 23rd Easter egg is about something on the back of Ark machines that most players never see, because looking at the back of an active Ark unit is generally a very short-lived experience. On several Ark unit types, there are what appear to be small camera-like ports, or apertures, on the rear of the chassis. These are not weapon ports. They do not interact with gameplay. They appear to be observational sensors positioned to face backward, while the unit's primary sensors face forward. In an organism, this would be described as a way of monitoring for threats from behind while remaining focused on a primary target ahead. In a machine, it suggests a design philosophy that assumes the machine will be observed or pursued from behind, and that the designers wanted the machine to be aware of this even while engaged frontally. Why an invading machine would have this feature is, to put it mildly, a strange question to sit with. The 24th Easter egg is about Ark Unit YD tags. The serial numbers we discussed earlier exist on all Ark units, but some units have secondary ID tags that are distinct from the serial numbers. These tags appear on fewer unit types and in fewer locations, and they are harder to read. Players who have catalogued them have noted that when the secondary IDs from multiple units are arranged in the sequence, they appear to suggest, based on their format, the resulting string contains what look like recognizable substrings. Specifically, some players have read short words from multiple human languages embedded within the tag sequences. These readings are not confirmed and they require some interpretation, but the fact that multiple independent players arrived at similar readings is worth noting. The 25th Easter egg is about colour. Ark machines in different zones have slightly different colour variations in their chassis plating. These variations are subtle enough that most players do not notice them consciously, but they are consistent. Players have catalogued the colour variations by zone and found that they correlate with the type of zone. Industrial zones have arc units with slightly more grey-green plating. Residential zones have arc units with slightly more beige-brown plating. Commercial zones have arc units whose plating tends toward a cooler, more blue-grey tone. One possible reading is that the Ark machines have adapted their coloration to blend better with their primary environment, the way some real-world organisms adjust coloration to their habitat. Another reading is that the colour variation indicates different manufacturing batches or different operational designations for different zone types. Either way, it is a deliberate design choice embedded in the colour palette of the machines themselves. The 26th Easter egg is about pre-applied damage on Ark machines. We mentioned the pre-applied wear earlier, but some Ark units also carry pre-applied damage that looks different from standard combat scarring. On a handful of specific Ark unit types, there are what appear to be impact marks or burn patterns that are too large and too specifically shaped to have come from player weapons. The shapes of some of these marks are consistent with the kind of damage that would result from a large explosion or a high-caliber military weapon system. This pre-applied damage suggests these machines have been in conflicts before players encounter them. Conflicts that involved weapons significantly heavier than anything in the player's arsenal. Who or what was fighting them before the players showed up is not addressed anywhere in the game's dialogue or lore text, but the damage is there. The 27th Easter egg is about the way Ark machines orient their heads before attacking. Players have noticed and documented that many Ark unit types perform a specific head orientation movement in the moments before they initiate combat. Most players interpret this as a general alert or acquisition animation, but a closer look reveals that the head movement is not pointing toward the player. It is pointing slightly off to the side, and the direction it points is consistent across observations. Specifically, the Ark machine appears to briefly orient its head toward a fixed point in the environment, not toward the threat before engaging. One possible reading is that this is a targeting or communication behavior, with the unit briefly checking in with some external reference point before committing to action. Another reading is that it is an animation artifact, but the consistency of the direction across observations is difficult to explain as a coincidence. The 28th Easter egg is one that a very specific group of dedicated players discovered, and that has been validated multiple times since. There is a single Ark unit instance that appears in every playable map in the same relative position within that map. It is not always the same unit type, but the position is always the same, in the northwest corner of the map's central zone, near whatever structure occupies that area. The unit in that position always has the same secondary ID tag from the series we discussed earlier. It is always slightly more passive than other units of its type in the area, requiring greater provocation to enter combat mode. And it is always, when destroyed, the last unit to go down in that immediate area, as if the other nearby units clear before it. Players have now confirmed this across enough map variants that it appears to be completely intentional. What this specific unit is, why it is placed in the same spot in every map, and why it behaves slightly differently from its counterparts, remains one of the more open questions in the Ark Raiders community. Everything in this chapter, taken together, points towards something the game clearly wants you to wonder about without directly answering. The Ark machines have serial numbers that predate the invasion. They have behavioral patterns that mirror Earth-native organisms. They have secondary markings that may contain human language fragments. They have pre-applied damage from weapons that players never encounter. And they have a consistent individual instance that appears in every map in the same position, with the same secondary ID. The game is laying breadcrumbs. It is not telling you where the crumbs lead, but the direction they point is toward a history for the Ark machines that is significantly more complicated than simple extraterrestrial invasion. Something about their origin does not add up. This chapter is about noticing that it does not add up. The later chapters will give us more pieces to work with. Chapter 3. Faction Secrets. Ark Raiders has factions. Players are affiliated with a raider community, and there are other factions in the world with their own histories, their own territories, and their own secrets. This chapter covers 14 Easter eggs hidden in the faction-related details of the game, from hidden symbols to competing graffiti to supply drops that raise questions about who is really operating in these zones and why. The 29th Easter egg is embedded in the texture of player equipment. The Raider faction uses a specific symbol as its identifier, which most players recognize from the interface and the NPC insignia. But if you look very closely at the texture detail on several pieces of standard Raider equipment, specifically on the shoulder plates and the inner collar of the standard jacket, the Raider symbol appears again in a much smaller, less prominent form. This version of the symbol is slightly different from the standard version. The proportions are different, and there is a small additional element in the center that does not appear in the public-facing version of the symbol. One possible reading is that this is the original Raider symbol before it was simplified for public presentation. Another reading is that the inner version is a different designation entirely, used internally but not displayed publicly. Either way, it is a detail that most players never see because it requires looking at equipment you are wearing, which is something most players simply do not do. The 30th Easter egg is a supply crate found in a specific location in one of the outer zones. The crate is standard in appearance but carries a faction marking on its side that does not match any of the known factions in the game. The marking is not the Raider symbol, not any Ark faction identifier, and not any of the background government or military symbols found in Pre-ark ruins. It is its own distinct design. Players have been photographing and documenting this marking for some time, and the consensus is that it was placed deliberately. Whether it represents a faction that has not yet appeared in the game, a faction that existed before the Ark arrival and has since dissolved, or something else entirely, is unclear. But the marking is too well rendered to be an oversight or a placeholder. The 31st Easter egg involves the government seals visible in certain underground bunker environments. Several of the bunkers that players can access have government insignia on the walls, on equipment panels, and on document covers. These seals follow a consistent design language that suggests a specific pre-ark governmental entity. Players have analysed the design elements of these seals and noted that they share characteristics with governmental design languages from specific real-world regions without being identical to any of them. The seal design suggests a government that drew on multiple national traditions, possibly a coalition or a multinational body, which is an interesting detail about the pre-ark world's political structure. It suggests that the world of Ark Raiders had significant international cooperation at the governmental level, at least in the areas dealing with underground infrastructure and emergency preparedness. The 32nd Easter egg is about graffiti. In the underground living quarters visible in certain zones, there is layer upon layer of graffiti on the walls, which is exactly what you would expect from spaces occupied by multiple groups over time. But if you look carefully at the graffiti, you can see that it is not all from the same period. Some of it is clearly newer, applied over older layers, and in several spots competing faction symbols have been painted on top of each other in a way that tells a story about who controlled this space and in what order. In one specific corridor, the sequence of overlapping symbols shows 5 distinct factions having claimed this space over time, with the raider symbol being the most recently applied. The older symbols include 2 that are not found elsewhere in the game, suggesting either factions that no longer exist or groups that predate the current raider community by a significant margin. The 33rd Easter egg is a map. In one of the Scar community areas, pinned to a wall behind a partially collapsed shelving unit, is a hand-drawn map. The map is detailed enough to be readable, and it depicts a layout that broadly matches one of the game's zones. But the map includes areas that do not exist in the playable version of that zone. There are corridors shown on the map that lead to spaces players cannot access, rooms that are labelled but not present, and at least one large area indicated by a dotted outline on the map's edge that extends beyond the map's apparent boundary. Players have speculated about whether this map represents areas that were cut from the game during development, areas that exist but are not yet accessible, or simply a fictional in-world document that is not meant to correspond exactly to real geography. The detail with which it is rendered suggests it is not a mistake or a throwaway prop. The 34th Easter egg is in the raider radio communications that players can sometimes intercept or overhear in certain zones. These communications reference missions, operations, and events. Most of what they reference aligns with things the player knows about from in-game lore, but occasionally a radio communication references a mission or an event that has no corresponding information anywhere in the game. These references are specific enough to sound real, with call signs, locations, and outcomes mentioned, but they correspond to nothing in the game's documented lore. One possible reading is that these are references to a deeper history of raider activity that the game has not yet revealed. Another reading is that they are ambient flavor detail without specific lore significance. The level of specificity in the references makes the former reading feel more plausible. The 35th Easter egg is about food. Different faction territories in the game's underground spaces have different kinds of stored food. This is a detail that most players overlook entirely, but the variety and type of stored food in different areas tells you something about how each group is sustaining itself. The raider community's food stores include a mix of scavenged packaged goods and what appear to be self-produced items, canned goods with handmade labels, dried food stored in repurposed containers. Other faction territories have food stores that suggest different approaches. One area has food stores that are primarily manufactured goods, all of the same type and packaging, suggesting access to some form of organized production. Another area has almost no food storage at all, which raises questions about how that group is sustaining itself. These details are never addressed in dialogue. They are just there in the textures of the shelves and containers. The 36th Easter egg is a hidden faction flag. In one zone, behind a section of collapsed wall that requires some deliberate navigation to get past, there is a small room. The room is empty except for a flag pinned to the back wall. The flag is not from any of the game's known factions. It uses colours and a symbol design that does not appear anywhere else in the game. The room shows signs of recent use, with recent being relative in this world, in that the floor is less dusty than the surrounding areas, and there is a cleared space in the centre of the room that looks like it might have had furniture in it not too long ago. The flag itself is in better condition than most fabric found in the game's environments. Whatever faction this flag represents, they were using this room not long before players started running the zone. The 37th Easter egg involves messages that players have found in specific locations across different zones. These messages, some handwritten and some typed on repurposed equipment, appear to be correspondence between parties who are not affiliated with any of the game's named factions. The messages discuss supply routes, personnel movements, and resource allocation in terms that suggest an organised operation. Some of the messages reference a third party by a designation that does not match any known faction name. The designation appears to be an abbreviation or a code name. Players have attempted to decode it with mixed results. What seems clear is that these messages are not placed randomly. They are positioned consistently across zones in a way that suggests a deliberate trail, almost as if the developers placed them to be found and followed. The 38th Easter egg is about faction-specific graffiti codes. Some of the faction graffiti found in the game's zones is not purely symbolic. Some of it contains what appear to be directional or numerical notations hidden within the larger design. Players who have focused on this have found that certain graffiti pieces, when the embedded notation is decoded, produce what looks like coordinate data. The coordinates correspond to specific locations within the zone where the graffiti appears. Players who have followed these coordinates have found either a notable environmental detail at the destination or a secondary piece of graffiti that continues the trail. One chain of graffiti-based coordinates has been traced through 4 consecutive stops before ending at a sealed door that players have not found a way to open. The 39th Easter egg is a collection of personal effects found in an abandoned safe house in one of the zones. The safe house is small and clearly inhabited until recently, but the personal effects in it, a pair of boots near the door, a folded jacket on a shelf, some documents on a makeshift desk, suggest that these belong to someone specific rather than generic abandoned items. The documents are partially readable and reference a leadership role, describing decisions made about personnel, resources, and territorial boundaries. Combined with the specific way the boots are placed and the jacket is folded, the safe house gives the impression of someone who is organized, methodical, and responsible for others. There is no name attached to any of these items, but the combination of details feels like a specific person, not a generic inhabitant. The 40th Easter egg is one that several players have described as their favourite in this category. In a specific room found in one of the mid-zone structures, 2 faction supply drops are present at the same time. Not 1, but 2 from what appear to be competing factions based on their markings. Both drops are unopened and in good condition. The room shows no sign of combat or conflict. Both drops are simply there, side by side, in a room that could only have been accessed by someone who knew it was there. One possible reading is that this is a neutral exchange point, a location used by multiple factions to leave supplies for each other or for a shared third party. The fact that neither drop has been opened suggests the recipient never arrived to collect them. The 41st Easter egg is about a specific floor marking. In several locations across the zones, there is a symbol painted directly onto the floor of certain rooms. The symbol is the same in each location, and it does not match any known faction identifier. Its design is simple, a circle with 2 short lines extending from the bottom, which some players have described as resembling a stylized figure with legs. Other players have interpreted it as a directional marker or a designation symbol. What makes it an Easter egg rather than just ambient detail is its consistency. The same symbol, the same proportions, the same colour in multiple locations across different zones that are otherwise not visually connected to each other. Something or someone placed this symbol in all of these locations, and no in-game text or dialogue acknowledges it. The 42nd Easter egg is in the maintenance tunnels that run between structures in certain zones. These tunnels are functional spaces that players use for navigation, and they tend to be visually sparse, but in several tunnel sections carved directly into the concrete or metal of the tunnel walls, there are small marks that players have identified as a primitive sign language or marker system. Some of the marks are directional, some appear to be warnings, some appear to designate specific rooms or junctions. The marks are not the work of the game's known factions, whose visual language is distinct from these carvings. They appear to predate the current raider community. One possible reading is that they were left by very early survivors in the first period after the Ark arrival, before organised factions existed. people moving through these tunnels in the dark, leaving marks for whoever came after them. The faction Easter eggs, as a group, paint a picture of a world that is more politically complex than the game's surface narrative suggests. The known factions are the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of human organization and conflict in the post-ark world. There are groups operating that have no names in the game's official lore. There are systems of communication and exchange happening that the game does not document. And there are histories here in the layered graffiti and the competing supply drops and the carved tunnel markers that extend back further than the current raider community and forward into a future that the game has not yet addressed. The factions in Ark Raiders are not a settled political landscape. They are an ongoing negotiation among people who are still figuring out how to survive, and the Easter eggs in this chapter are some of the most direct evidence of that ongoing negotiation. Chapter 4. Words on Walls. This chapter is about text. Ark Raiders is full of written words, on walls, on paper, on screens, on packaging. Most of it is ambient detail, but some of it is Easter eggs, placed deliberately to tell a specific part of the story that no other element of the game communicates. This chapter covers 14 of the most significant pieces of writing hidden in the game's world. The 43rd Easter egg is one of the most emotionally direct things in the game. In one of the ruined residential zones, accessible through a window on the upper floor of a damaged apartment building, there is a room that appears to have been used as a shelter after the Ark arrival. The walls have handwritten notes on them, some on paper attached to the wall and some written directly on the painted surface. The notes describe the writer's experience of the first Ark attack. The account is not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It is practical and frightened and specific. The writer notes what they could hear, what the light looked like, what time they think it was. The account ends mid-sentence, not with any kind of dramatic conclusion, just in the middle of a description of what the writer was planning to do next. Whatever they planned to do next, they did not have time to write it down. The 44th Easter egg is a grocery list. Grocery lists are all over the game, as you would expect in a world where scavenging is how you survive, but one specific grocery list found on a counter in a ruined kitchen in a residential zone is different from the others. The list has two columns. The left column is the standard grocery list format, items, quantities, notes. The right column is something else. The items in the right column have no obvious relationship to grocery shopping. They are a mix of numbers, abbreviated words, and what appear to be location descriptors. Players who have tried to decode the right column as a code of some kind have come up with results that vary, but one interpretation that has gained traction in the community reads the right column as a set of directions to a specific location within the zone. Following these interpreted directions leads to an area that contains a secondary note, which continues the trail. The 45th Easter egg is a child's drawing. In a bedroom, in one of the residential zones, among other children's artwork pinned to a wall or adhered with tape, there is one drawing that is distinct from the others. The others are typical children's drawings: houses, animals, family figures. But one drawing, clearly by the same child based on the artistic style, depicts something quite different. It shows what can only be described as an Ark machine. The proportions are simplified the way children's drawings always are, but the essential shape, the limb configuration, the central sensor cluster, the overall silhouette is recognisably Ark. The drawing is coloured in the way a child would colour it, with whatever crayons or markers were available, which means it is partly blue and partly orange and partly red, with no particular accuracy. But the shape is unmistakable. This child drew an Ark machine, and based on the condition of the paper and how it is displayed alongside other drawings, this was not drawn after the invasion. It appears to have been drawn before. The 46th Easter egg is on a classroom chalkboard. In an elementary school accessible in one of the zones, a classroom has a physics equation on the chalkboard. The equation is partially erased, with only the right half of it still legible. Players who have studied the legible portion and attempted to reconstruct the full equation based on standard physics notation have arrived at something interesting. The visible portion is consistent with an equation describing orbital mechanics, specifically the calculation of a trajectory for an object approaching from a high orbit. Physics teachers do not typically put orbital mechanics problems on elementary school chalkboards. This suggests either that the classroom was being used by someone else after the school closed, or that this particular classroom had a very unusual curriculum. Neither explanation is entirely comfortable. The 47th Easter egg is in the maintenance logs. Several of the game's underground facilities have maintenance log systems, either paper-based or on dead electronic terminals. These logs document routine facility maintenance in the standard format you would expect: system checks, repair records, supply orders. But in at least 3 separate facilities, the maintenance logs contain entries that describe observations about the Ark machines before anyone in the game's world apparently understood what they were. The entries describe observed behaviors and describe them in terms of wildlife behavior, using language like territorial patterns and nesting activity and seasonal movement. Whoever was writing these logs noticed something in the period before the invasion became undeniable, and they described what they saw using the language of natural history because they did not have any other framework for it. The 48th Easter egg is a love letter. Found tucked into the breast pocket of a coat on a display mannequin in what appears to have been a clothing store in one zone, the letter is on stationery that still has its original crispness, protected by the pocket and the relative dryness of the store's interior. The letter is readable and personal in the way love letters tend to be, full of specific references to shared experiences and future plans. The future plans described in the letter include a specific date, which players have cross-referenced with the calendar Easter eggs discussed in Chapter 1. The date in the letter is 2 weeks after the latest date on the calendars, which means the writer of this letter was making plans for 2 weeks after everything ended. The letter was written before the calendars froze. It was written by someone who fully expected to be alive in 2 weeks and still had things they were looking forward to. The 49th Easter egg is a countdown. In a bathroom in one of the residential zones, someone has written numbers on the wall in what appears to be a permanent marker. The numbers count down from 30 and the counting stops at 0. Next to the 0, there is a word rendered in the same handwriting that players have read as either done or gone, depending on the handwriting interpretation. This countdown could mean any number of things. It could be days of supplies. It could be days of waiting for rescue. It could be something else entirely. What makes it an Easter egg rather than just ambient detail is the artwork around it. The numbers are surrounded by small drawings, mostly of simple shapes and symbols, that appear to have been added over time as the countdown progressed. The drawings around 30 are minimal. The drawings around 0 are dense. Someone spent 30 days in that bathroom, or at minimum 30 meaningful units of time, and they recorded each one. The 50th Easter egg is a collection of warning signs painted by someone after the Ark invasion. These are distinct from pre-Ark signage, which is standardized and printed. The post-Ark warning signs are hand-painted and use a symbol language that the painter apparently invented on the spot. Players have found these signs in multiple locations and documented the symbols. Some symbols appear to warn of Ark machine patrol areas. Some appear to indicate safe paths. Some appear to mark locations of specific resources. The symbol language is consistent enough across locations that it clearly comes from the same source, one person or one organized group who moved through these zones and left a trail of guidance for others. Nobody in the game's dialogue acknowledges this symbol system or this unknown painter. The signs are just there. The 51st Easter egg is a news bulletin board, visible in a community space in one of the zones. The board has printed and handwritten items pinned to it, and they cover a range of topics. But the most interesting items are the ones that date from the very early period of the Ark arrival, before it was publicly understood to be what it was. These early items describe the Ark machines as a meteor shower event and reference coverage in terms that suggest official messaging was treating the arrival as a natural phenomenon. Later items on the same board, clearly added after the initial framing collapsed, contradict the earlier ones directly. The board is a kind of archive of a community's information environment, changing in real time, from reassurance to confusion, to alarm to silence. The 52nd Easter egg is street art. Some of the graffiti on the outer walls of buildings in the zones is clearly pre-ark street art, the kind of elaborate, colourful, large-scale works that appear in cities with active urban art scenes. But in several locations there is more recent street art, layered on top of or alongside the older work. This newer art uses a different aesthetic, rougher and faster, and less technically accomplished, but thematically very direct. It depicts Ark machines. It depicts what appears to be human resistance. It depicts the underground communities. And it uses specific symbols that appear to reference the post-Ark political landscape, in ways that, combined with the faction Easter eggs from Chapter 3, tell a story about how survivors have processed and represented their own situation artistically. The most recent piece of street art, identifiable by its position over older work, shows what appears to be a raider symbol at the centre of a sunburst. Whether this is defiant optimism or something else is left to the viewer. The 53rd Easter egg is a handwritten menu found in a restaurant in one zone. The menu is a daily specials board, the kind of thing a small restaurant would write out each morning. The items on it are what you would expect from a casual restaurant in a pre-Ark world. But the prices on the menu are what make this an Easter egg rather than ambient detail. The prices are very specific, and players who have paid attention to other price-related details in the game, on receipts, on store tags, have noted that the restaurant's prices are significantly higher than similar items priced in pre-Ark retail environments. This is the kind of detail that, in a real historical document, would indicate an inflationary period, a time when prices were rising noticeably. The restaurant's daily specials were priced at a level that suggests the pre-Ark world was experiencing significant economic stress even before the Ark arrived, which is an interesting context for everything else. The 54th Easter egg is a note slipped under a locked door. In one of the residential buildings, there is a door that players cannot open. Under the door, extending slightly into the corridor, is the corner of a piece of paper. The note cannot be fully read from the corridor, but the small visible portion contains what appears to be the beginning of a question. Players have debated what the full question might be, and some have used game cameras or positioning tricks to get a partial view of more of the note, though the results are not conclusive. The door has not opened for any player through any legitimate means documented so far. Whatever is on the other side of that door, and whatever the full note says, remains a mystery. But the note's presence under the door and the beginning of a question visible at its edge is clearly deliberate. Somebody wanted players to know there was a question being asked, even if they could not read it. The 55th Easter egg involves library books. In the school zones and in one standalone library building, accessible in certain runs, books are scattered throughout the space. Most of them are closed and unreadable, but a handful of them are left open to specific pages, and the text on those pages, though rendered at a resolution that makes it challenging to read in detail, is partly legible. Players who have gotten close enough to read the legible portions have found that the books left open are not open to random pages. They are open to pages that contain specific information relevant to the game's lore. One book is open to a page discussing early space exploration and object tracking programs. Another is open to a page discussing the physics of machine learning and autonomous system design. A third is open to a page discussing historical precedents for organised societal responses to catastrophic environmental events. These books were not left open by accident. The 56th Easter egg is a code carved into a tree. In one of the outdoor areas accessible in certain zones, there is a mature tree that survived the Ark invasion's initial damage, though it shows stress. Carved into the bark of this tree, at eye level, is a series of marks. The marks are not letters or numbers in any standard format, but they follow a system that players have compared to historical tree carving traditions, particularly the kind of directional and resource marking systems used by travellers and hunters in various historical periods. When this carved code is interpreted using the symbol-to-meaning conventions of those traditions, it appears to indicate the direction and approximate distance to a specific resource. Players who have followed the indicated direction and distance have arrived at a partially buried container that contains items placed there by someone who used this tree as a navigation marker. The container's contents are not extraordinary, but they're clearly placed deliberately, and the system of indication is intricate enough to be impressive. The written Easter eggs in Ark Raiders collectively function as a kind of parallel history. There are the stories the factions tell about themselves, the official accounts of the Ark arrival, the documented lore, and then there is this other layer of text, handwritten, carved, painted, and left in pockets and under doors, that tells the Ark Raiders story from the ground up, from the perspective of people who did not have any official account to rely on. The child's drawing of the Ark machine is perhaps the most striking example of this. An official lore document might tell you about the first confirmed sighting of Ark machines, but the child's drawing tells you that at least one child somewhere had seen or dreamed of or imagined something like an Ark machine before the invasion made that knowledge universal. The text Easter eggs are the game's way of suggesting that the story of what happened was more complicated and more human than any official account could fully capture. Chapter 5. Audio Easter eggs. Sound is the element of game design that players are most likely to take for granted. You hear it, you process it for threat information, and you move on. But Ark Raiders has embedded a significant number of Easter eggs into its audio design, some hidden in ambient soundscapes, some in specific objects, and some in the sounds the Ark machines themselves produce. This chapter covers 14 of them, and several of these require careful listening rather than careful looking. The 57th Easter egg involves a radio broadcast. In one of the ruined commercial buildings, accessible in certain zones, there is a radio receiver on a backroom counter. The radio is on. It is powered by what appears to be a small emergency battery pack still attached to the unit. The broadcast it plays is not music or ambient static. It is a repeating loop of what sounds like a distress signal, read in a calm, automated voice, giving coordinates and a status update. The coordinates given in the broadcast, when mapped to the game's coordinate system, point to a location that players have been able to identify as an area within one of the game's zones. What is at that location is the subject of ongoing community investigation, but the broadcast is clearly playing a real signal originating from a real in-game location. Whether the location it points to contains anything significant is one of the questions this Easter egg raises without answering. The 58th Easter egg is a record player. In the upper floor of a residential building in one of the zones, a record player is still running. The record it is playing has reached its end, and the needle is riding the inner groove, producing the rhythmic click that records make when they have finished playing and the arm has not been lifted. But the record player itself is still powered, still running, still clicking with each rotation. This record player has been running for what the game implies is years. The motor is still turning, the needle is still riding the groove, the click is still sounding. Everything around this record player has collapsed and corroded and gone dark, and this small machine has continued doing the only thing it was designed to do, playing the record that was placed on it even after the record itself ended. The 59th Easter egg is a ringing phone. In one of the office buildings accessible in certain zones, a desk phone is ringing. It rings at regular intervals, several seconds on and several seconds off, in the standard pattern of an incoming call. The phone is clearly not connected to any active network. There is no functional telecommunications infrastructure in this world. The ringing is coming from the phone's own internal emergency battery backup, which has been tripped by some kind of lingering signal in the environment, or at least that is one way to explain it. Another possible reading is that the developers simply wanted a ringing phone in this space as an unanswerable question in audio form. Who is calling? There is nobody to call. There is nobody to answer. The phone rings anyway, with the same regularity it would have had on the day it was last answered. The 60th Easter egg is in the ambient hum of one specific zone. All of the game's zones have ambient audio, wind, distant mechanical sounds, structural settling, Ark machine activity at a distance. But in one zone, the ambient hum that underlies everything has a tonal quality that is distinct. Players who have isolated this hum, recorded it, and analysed it have found that the hum is not a single drone note. It is a chord, 3 distinct frequencies sounding simultaneously. When those 3 frequencies are identified, they correspond to notes that form a recognisable musical interval. Specifically, the interval is one that Western music theory describes as a minor third plus a tritone, a combination that Western musical convention has historically associated with tension and unresolved expectation. Whether the audio designers chose this deliberately, or whether it's emerged from the layering of separate audio elements in a way nobody planned, is unclear. But it is there. The 61st Easter egg is one of the most discussed in the Ark Raiders community, and it involves Ark machine audio specifically. If you capture the ambient sound produced by a standard Ark unit during its patrol state, and then apply digital audio processing to reverse and significantly slow the audio, the resulting sound has characteristics that players have found difficult to explain. The reversed and slowed audio has a tonal quality and a rhythmic structure that multiple independent players have described as speech-like. The specific characteristics that create this impression are the variations in amplitude and pitch that occur at intervals consistent with syllable production in human speech. Nobody has claimed to hear specific words, but the pattern of the reversed audio, its rhythm, its modulation, its variation, is consistent with the kind of pattern produced by a human voice, speaking at a pace that the processing has dramatically elongated. This Easter egg, more than almost any other in the game, is the one that the Ark Raiders community returns to most often. The 62nd Easter egg is a child's toy. In one of the residential zones, in a child's bedroom, there is a toy on the floor near the foot of the bed. The toy is a small musical device of the kind that plays a simple melody when a button is pressed. Under normal circumstances, the toy's battery would have died long ago, and pressing the button would produce nothing. But in Ark Raiders, if you interact with the toy, it plays. The melody it plays is brief, 8 notes, and recognisable in its structure as a lullaby format. Players have transcribed the 8 notes and found that the specific note sequence does not correspond to any known lullaby. The sequence is original, but it has the structure and character of a lullaby. The developers wrote a piece of music for this toy, not a generic tune, an original composition of 8 notes in a lullaby style, placed in a child's bedroom in a ruined world, designed for one brief moment of softness in an otherwise harsh audio environment. The 63rd Easter egg is about the wind. In certain corridors within the game's structures, particularly in long narrow spaces with openings at both ends, the wind audio is noticeably different from the generic wind ambient in open spaces. The wind in these corridors has a rhythmic quality, a rise and fall in volume that repeats at a consistent interval. Players who have measured this interval have found it to be roughly 4 seconds on and 4 seconds off, which is close to the human respiratory rate at rest. This is almost certainly coincidental. Corridors produce rhythmic wind effects based on their geometry and the ambient wind conditions simulated in the game. But the resemblance to breathing is close enough that players have noted it. And once you notice it, these corridors have a very different feeling to walk through. The 64th Easter egg is an empty room with footsteps. This one is the most hotly debated audio Easter egg in the game because it's not consistently reproducible. Several players have reported hearing footstep audio emanating from a specific room in one of the zone structures, a room that they subsequently confirmed was empty. The footsteps, when heard, are described as walking pace, not running, moving in a roughly circular pattern within the room. Some players have experienced this, most have not. The debates in the community centre on whether this is a rare audio bug, a deliberate Easter egg triggered by specific conditions, or an emergent phenomenon from the way the game's audio engine propagates sound from adjacent spaces. The accounts of players who have heard it are consistent enough with each other to rule out simple fabrication. Whatever is causing it is real. What it means is less clear. The 65th Easter egg is a television set. In several locations throughout the zones, television sets are present in ruined living rooms and commercial spaces. Most of them are dead and dark, which is expected. But in 2 specific locations, the television sets are displaying content. Not clear content, not a legible broadcast, but cycling static with occasional visual fragments appearing. These fragments are brief and mostly uninterpretable, but players who have recorded their sessions and reviewed the footage have documented specific frames in the static cycles that appear to show recognizable shapes. One set appears to briefly display what looks like a satellite image of a geographic area. Another appears to briefly display what looks like a human figure in silhouette. These fragments appear for 1 to 3 frames at a time before returning to static. They are clearly present in the game files because players have been able to confirm them in recorded footage. What they are meant to convey is not clear. The 66th Easter egg is a specific door. In one of the inner zones there is a heavy security door, the kind with multiple locking mechanisms. The door has a notable audio signature when you approach it, a low reverberation that the game's audio engine produces as ambient space audio, but this door's audio signature is not generic. The low tone the door produces when you're close to it matches, in its frequency and its resonance characteristics, the tone of the Ark attack warning sirens that players encounter during certain events. Not exactly, the door's tone is much quieter and requires close proximity to hear, but the fundamental frequency is the same. One possible reading is that this is an unintentional coincidence in the audio design. Another reading is that this door's audio was deliberately tuned to the same frequency as the Ark warning sirens, as a way of suggesting a connection between what is behind the door and the Ark machines themselves. The 67th Easter egg is in the audio landscape of the underground base. The background ambient audio of the Raider underground spaces includes multiple overlapping layers of sound, the standard noise of an inhabited community, conversation, movement, machinery. But players who have isolated specific audio layers from recorded sessions have found that one of the background layers contains fragments of conversation that are not attributable to any visible NPC. These background voices are too quiet and too fragmentary to be clearly understood in normal gameplay, but when isolated and amplified, they form partial sentences. The partial sentences that players have documented are not random conversational fragments. They appear to be discussing something specific, with references to locations, timelines, and decisions that suggest a conversation of some importance. Who is having this conversation, where they are, and what it concerns is never explained in the game's surface narrative. The 68th Easter egg is one that was discovered by players experimenting with multiplayer session sizes. The background musical elements in certain zones, specifically the layered tonal ambient that plays at low volume throughout exploration, change subtly depending on how many players are present in the session. In a solo session, the ambient tone is a single sustained note. In a two-player session, a second tone appears alongside it. In a three-player session, a third tone is added. In a four-player session, a fourth tone completes the harmonic structure. Each additional tone is placed at an interval that builds toward a specific chord, and the completed four-player chord is a major seventh, conventionally associated with a feeling of resolution or arrival. The solo note is a root note. The four-player chord is the completed harmony. The game is rewarding full-party play with a resolved musical experience that the solo player never hears. The 69th Easter egg is a sound design detail that players discovered by accident when a community member was comparing sound design notes with another game community. The sound that plays when an arc machine of a specific class is permanently destroyed, its death sound, has a waveform that closely resembles the waveform of a specific real-world recording. The real-world recording in question is a historical audio document, a transmission recorded during an early period of radio astronomy, a naturally occurring radio signal from space that became famous among astronomers and the general public in the following decades. The resemblance is not perfect, but the structural similarity of the waveforms is close enough that the player who noticed it went to significant effort to document and share it. Whether the Ark Raiders audio team deliberately based the machine death sound on this historical signal, or whether the resemblance is coincidental, is something only the developers can answer, but the similarity exists. The 70th Easter egg is an alarm system. In one of the commercial buildings accessible in certain zones, there is a security alarm panel still mounted on a wall. The panel is not active in any gameplay sense, but it emits a very faint beeping, audible only in close proximity. Players who have recorded this beeping and transcribed its pattern have found that it is not a random distress signal or a standard alarm pattern. The beeping follows the rhythm and duration conventions of Morse code. Transcribed as Morse code, the pattern produces a repeating message. The message is a short sequence of characters that, when interpreted as Morse, produces a three-word phrase. The phrase itself has been decoded by multiple players independently, and the agreement on the translation is strong. The three words in question are not a distress call or a warning or a location. They are a statement in the past tense, present tense, or future tense, depending on how you interpret the grammar, about something having changed. The exact wording that players have settled on is not alarming or dramatic. It is understated in the way that the most effective Easter eggs tend to be. Something changed. The alarm is still saying so, to anyone quiet enough to listen. Audio Easter eggs occupy a different place in the Ark Raiders experience than visual ones. They require a different kind of attention. You have to be still, and you have to be quiet, and you have to be willing to listen to something that is not immediately rewarding. The record player that has been running for years, clicking at the inner groove, the lullaby from a child's toy in an empty room, the phone that keeps ringing with no one to answer it. These are not loud Easter eggs. They are quiet ones, and their quietness is part of what makes them effective. The game is asking you to slow down enough to hear what the world is still saying, even after everything that happened to it. Chapter 6. Below the Surface, Map Secrets and Hidden Areas. Ark Raiders is an extraction shooter, which means players are always moving, always managing resources, always watching for threats. The last thing most players do is stop and try every possible route through a zone to see if there is something they missed. But some of the most interesting Easter eggs in the game are in the places players never go. The hidden rooms, the sealed tunnels, the spaces accessible only through specific and non-obvious routes. This chapter covers 14 of them. The 71st Easter egg is a room that only becomes accessible after a specific sequence of actions in a specific order. The room itself is not remarkable. It is a small storage space with a few items in it. But the sequence of actions required to access it is. Players discovered this room because one player, moving quickly through a zone and interacting with objects in an unusual order, found themselves in a space they had never seen before. Subsequent attempts to replicate the discovery revealed that the sequence of interactions required is not intuitive and would not be discovered through normal gameplay. The specific sequence involves interacting with 3 objects in a particular order in rooms that are not close to each other before approaching the hidden room's entrance within a certain time window. Whether this is intentional room gating by the developers or a consequence of the game's physics engine responding to specific interaction states in an unintended way is something the community has debated at length. The room exists. Getting there consistently is still a challenge. The 72nd Easter egg is a collapsed tunnel that leads somewhere most players do not know about. In one of the outer zones, a section of wall in what appears to be a maintenance corridor has partially collapsed. The collapse blocks the main tunnel but creates a small opening at floor level. Players who have crawled through this opening find a short passage that leads to a door. The door opens to a pre-ark underground facility that is distinct from the zone's other underground spaces. The facility has different design language from the rest of the zone's infrastructure, suggesting it was built at a different time and for a different purpose. The equipment in the facility is also different, more specialized, and more technical than standard utility infrastructure. Several of the equipment panels in this facility have been noted by players as resembling research station setups. What this facility was researching, and for whom, is not labelled anywhere in the space. The 73rd Easter egg is a safe room. Somewhere in each of the game's main zones, there is a room that appears to have been used as a long-term shelter, rather than a temporary hiding spot. These rooms have the characteristics of long-term habitation, improvised furniture, organised storage, systems for managing limited resources, evidence of routine. Some of them have calendars or tally marks on the walls, indicating the occupant tracked time carefully. Some have small personal items suggesting the occupant tried to maintain some normalcy. What none of them have is any indication of how the occupant left, or whether they left voluntarily. In every case, the room looks occupied but empty, as if the person who lived there simply stepped out and never came back. The rooms are clean enough to suggest the occupant was orderly. The absence of personal emergency supplies suggests either they took everything with them or they did not expect to be gone long. The 74th Easter egg is cartographic. Players who have fully mapped the maintenance tunnel networks in one of the larger zones and then compared their maps have found that the overall shape of the tunnel network forms a pattern when viewed as a whole. The maintenance tunnels in most zones are laid out in functional grids based on the surface structures above them, which is what you would expect from utility infrastructure. But in one zone, the tunnel network deviates from this functional grid in ways that are too consistent to be accidental. The deviations, when mapped, produce an outline that resembles a specific geometric shape, not a letter or a number, but a geometric form with mathematical properties. Players have identified the shape as roughly consistent with a specific symbol used in certain mathematical and scientific contexts to denote a particular kind of relationship between values. The tunnel engineers who laid out this network were doing something beyond utility infrastructure design. The 75th Easter egg is an underwater section. In one zone's residential area, there is a house with a flooded basement. The basement is accessible through a window at ground level if you approach from the right angle, but the floor of the basement is underwater. Players who have gone into the water and looked around have found that the basement contains more than generic flood debris. There are objects at the bottom that appear to have been placed specifically, or at minimum that have settled in a configuration that tells a story. A child's bicycle still upright against a wall, with the water level above the seat. A wooden storage chest, open and empty, with its lid open against the floor. A plastic storage bin still sealed, with handwriting on the side that is partially legible. The bicycle in particular is an image that players have described as memorable, visible through the murky water, still standing as if waiting to be ridden. The 76th Easter egg is about a view from high up. In one zone, reaching a specific rooftop requires a route that most players have not discovered, involving a combination of structural climbing and a sequence of ledge traversals that is not telegraphed by the environment. Players who have reached this rooftop find that from its height they can see something in the middle distance that is not visible from ground level. Specifically, they can see a structure in what appears to be a distant part of the map that does not appear to be part of any accessible zone. The structure is too far away to resolve clearly, but it is clearly architectural, clearly large, and clearly not damaged in the way the accessible zones are. Whether this distant structure is a future zone, a background element without gameplay significance, or something else is not currently known, but it can only be seen from this one specific elevated position. The 77th Easter egg is a locked room. In the starting zone, which players pass through at the beginning of every run, there is a room that cannot be opened. The door is locked, and nothing in the starting zone provides a key or a code for it. Players have attempted to access it through every means available to them, including structural damage approaches, climbing over adjacent walls, and looking through the small window in the door. Through the window, players can see inside. The room contains a table with items on it. The items are not clearly identifiable at window resolution. They appear to include some kind of document or map laid flat on the table, and what may be a personal item of some kind beside it. Players pass through the starting zone before every run and have every opportunity to look at this room. None of them have ever gotten inside. The 78th Easter egg is a basement beneath a basement. In one of the underground community areas, players have found that what appears to be the floor of the lowest accessible level is not, in at least one location, the actual floor. Through a specific interaction with a particular section of flooring, players can access a space below the known lowest level of the underground area. This space is small, roughly the size of a large closet, and it contains a single chair and a single table. On the table, there is a single item. The item is a radio receiver. The radio receiver is active and tuned to a frequency. The frequency it is tuned to is the same as the emergency broadcast frequency discussed in Easter egg 57. The room beneath the room was built or used by someone who was listening to that broadcast, and who went to some trouble to do so in a space that no one else was likely to find. The 79th Easter egg is a network of crawl spaces. Buildings in Ark Raiders have crawl spaces above ceiling level, accessible in some places through loose ceiling panels. Players who have explored the crawl space network in one zone have discovered that the crawl spaces connect several buildings that are not otherwise directly accessible to each other at floor level. The crawl space network is functional and navigable, though slow, and it provides routes between buildings that avoid exposure to the surface. What makes this an Easter egg rather than just a design feature is what is in the crawl spaces. In 3 specific sections of the crawl space network, there are items stored above the ceiling, clearly placed there deliberately by someone who knew the network connected these buildings. The items include supplies, a sealed document wallet, and what appears to be a pre-prepared emergency kit. Someone used this crawl space network as a secure transport and storage route, and left these items in it. The 80th Easter egg is one of the most unnerving in the game for some players. In one zone, there is a room that shows signs of very recent habitation. The floor in the room is notably less dusty than surrounding areas. There is a container on a shelf that contains water that appears fresh. There is a small heat source, a handmade heating element of some kind that is still warm to the touch, and on a makeshift table there is food that has not yet decayed. Somebody was in this room very recently, in a game that appears to be set in a world abandoned for years. The room has one exit, the door through which the player enters. Players who reach this room frequently find it empty. Nobody is there, but somebody was there moments before. The game gives you no explanation for this. The 81st Easter egg is a hollow wall, in one specific corridor in one specific zone structure. Tapping the walls produces different audio feedback in a small section. The section in question sounds hollow when struck, compared to the solid concrete feedback of the surrounding wall. Players who have found this have confirmed that the section is accessible, though the access method is not obvious. Forcing the issue reveals a space between walls that contains a small cache of items, not combat-relevant items, but personal items, of the kind that suggest the cache was prepared by someone for reasons of sentimental preservation rather than survival need. The items include photographs, though the photograph subjects are not detailed enough to identify, a small notebook with handwriting, and a wrapped package whose contents are visible as a soft material, possibly clothing or a blanket. The 82nd Easter egg is an elevator shaft. In one of the large structures accessible in the game, there is a functional elevator shaft with a non-functional elevator. The elevator car is stuck partway down the shaft. Players can see the shaft's interior from the car and from the tops of the shaft, and the shaft itself extends both above and below the accessible play space. The below accessible section of the shaft goes down significantly further than the lowest accessible floor of the building would suggest is necessary. Standard elevator shafts extend below the lowest floor to allow for the elevator car's travel, but this shaft extends much further than that, past what any standard elevator pit would require. What is at the bottom of the shaft is not currently accessible to players. The shaft is too narrow and the distance too great for any currently available traversal method. But the shaft goes somewhere, and the depth of it suggests that somewhere is substantial. The 83rd Easter egg is a chalk trail. In one of the outdoor surface areas, accessible in certain zones, there are chalk marks on the ground and on wall surfaces. Chalk does not survive in the open for long, which makes these marks interesting. They are faded but still readable. Their patterns are clearly directional, with arrows and simple geometric guides pointing toward a specific destination. Players who have followed this trail have found that it leads to a specific building, then to a specific room within that building, then to a specific point within that room. At the end point of the trail, there is nothing obviously remarkable. The point the trail leads to is in the center of a clear patch of floor. Players have examined this floor section extensively. Something was here, and it was important enough that someone charted a trail to it with chalk. Whatever it was is gone now. The 84th Easter egg is a viewing platform, accessible through a route involving external climbing on one of the zone's larger structures. Players can reach a section of roof that has clearly been modified for intentional use. Someone built a small platform here or adapted an existing structural feature in a way that provides a stable standing position and a clear view in a specific direction. The view from this position looks directly toward one of the Ark machine concentration areas, the part of the zone where Ark units are most densely present. Someone sat here and watched the Ark machines. They built themselves a position to do it from. The platform is high enough and distant enough that Ark machines' detection systems are not triggered by a player standing here. You can observe them from this position without being seen. Whoever built this platform understood that, and they came up here and they watched for long enough that they modified the structure for comfort. The hidden spaces in Ark Raiders are not hidden by accident. The collapsed tunnel, the basement beneath the basement, the crawl space network, the viewing platform. Each of these required deliberate design decisions to create. None of them appear in any in-game tutorial or guide. None of them offer gameplay rewards significant enough to justify the effort required to find them. They exist because the developers wanted to put them there, and because hidden spaces serve a narrative function that visible ones cannot. They tell you that the world was navigated and used and survived in ways that the official story does not capture. People found the crawl spaces and stocked them. People climbed to the viewing platform and watched the machines. People built a room beneath a room to listen to a signal in privacy. The hidden spaces are where the most human parts of this post-ark world lived. Chapter 7. The Arsenal, Weapon and Gear Lore Easter Eggs. The weapons and gear in Ark Raiders are functional tools, but they are also artifacts with histories. They were made somewhere, used by someone, modified over time, and eventually found their way into the hands of the raider who is picking them up now. Embedded in their designs and descriptions are 14 Easter eggs that tell you about that history. The 85th Easter egg is a serial number. Most weapons in Ark Raiders have serial numbers, which is realistic for firearms and standard-issue military gear. But one specific weapon type has a serial number format that players have identified as matching a real-world military classification system structure, specifically the format used by certain NATO member countries for cataloguing small arms. The format is not identical to any specific real-world system, but it is close enough that players with knowledge of military serial number structures recognized the reference immediately. This would suggest either that the pre-ark world of Ark Raiders used the same, or a very similar arms cataloguing system to certain real-world militaries, or that the developers simply modeled the fictional serial number format on a real one without intending a specific lore implication. Either way, the detail is there. The 86th Easter egg is about engraving. Several weapons in the game have worn markings on their surfaces that are pre-applied rather than player-added. Most of these are wear and damage marks, but on a handful of specific weapon instances, players have found what appears to be engraved text, small, worn, but readable under close inspection. The engravings appear to be names, short personal names in a style consistent with the kind of personalization that soldiers and users of issued equipment sometimes add to their gear. The names are not names of any character in the game's known roster. They are names of people the game does not otherwise acknowledge, people who owned these weapons before the current world existed and whose stories are entirely contained in the brief inscription on a metal surface. The 87th Easter egg is about ammunition. Several of the ammunition boxes and container types in the game have manufacturer codes and date stamps on them, as real ammunition packaging does. Players who have catalogued these stamps have found that the manufacture dates span a significant range. The oldest manufactured ammunition in the game dates from well before the Ark arrival, based on the game's implied timeline. This is not surprising. Ammunition is stockpiled and can be stored for years. But the oldest dates are significantly further back than one would expect even for well-stocked military reserves. The oldest manufacture dates would suggest ammunition that was produced and stockpiled as much as 30 to 40 years before the Ark arrival, based on how the game frames its timeline. Why anyone was stockpiling ammunition in those quantities that long before the Ark arrived raises a question the game does not answer. The 88th Easter egg is a piece of armour. Among the armour pieces available in the game, one specific chest armour has a faint insignia visible on its interior surface, the side that faces the body of the wearer. The insignia is not one of the game's faction symbols. It is different in design language, more formally structured, with the characteristics of a military unit insignia rather than a community or faction symbol. Players have compared this insignia to known military design conventions and found it most closely resembles the kind of patch used by special operations units in various real-world military structures. The insignia would have been on the inside of the armour, invisible during use, which is where a unit or personal insignia would be placed if the wearer wanted it present, but not visible to observers. The 89th Easter egg is in a weapon description. The game provides flavor text for many of its weapons, and one specific weapon's flavor text references a battle that does not appear in any other piece of lore in the game. The battle is described in one short sentence in the flavor text, named with a specific designation that sounds like a military operation name, and characterized in terms that suggest it was a significant engagement. The weapon is described as having been manufactured in the immediate aftermath of this battle, implying the battle's outcome influenced arms production. Nobody in the game's dialogue ever references this battle. It appears nowhere else. The one sentence of flavor text is the only evidence that this engagement ever occurred in the game's world. The 90th Easter egg is about modification tags. Some weapons in the game have aftermarket modifications, upgraded components added after original manufacture. On several of these weapons, the modifications have handwritten tags attached to them, small labels of the kind a craftsperson might attach to completed work. These tags have names or initials on them. In one case, the initials on a modification tag match the initials of a character whose name appears in an environmental note in the zone where that weapon is most commonly found. This connection between a physical object and a written record connects two pieces of the game's world that most players would never think to associate with each other, and it suggests that the modification was made specifically by the person referenced in the note, working in this zone, on equipment that remained here after they left. The 91st Easter egg is about a repaired weapon. One specific weapon instance that players can find in a specific location, in one zone, shows evidence of having been repaired multiple times using different materials. The stock has been replaced with wood from a different source than the original. The grip has been wrapped with a material that players have identified as a repurposed industrial rubber compound. The barrel has been rethreaded at some point, evidenced by tool marks around the threading, and the trigger mechanism has been replaced with a component that is not from the same weapon type, field improvised to fit. This weapon was maintained by someone who did not have access to proper parts, who improvised solutions to keep it functional over an extended period of time. The weapon is a document of someone's commitment to keeping it working, using whatever was available. The 92nd Easter egg is about a specific backpack. One backpack available in the game has a set of external pouches that have been organized and packed in a way that most players never examine, because you would need to look at the item's texture detail from close range. The pouches contain generic stored items for the most part, but in one external pouch the items stored there are not generic. Players with close-look camera positioning have identified what appears to be a folded photograph, a small notebook, and a wrapped food item of the kind you would prepare for yourself rather than find in a store. These items are not gameplay relevant. They cannot be extracted or used. They are simply in the pouch, as if the person who packed this bag was preparing for a specific journey they had thought carefully about, packing not just practical items, but personal ones. The 93rd Easter egg is a medkit with a name tag. Medkits in Ark Raiders have a standard design, with a cross symbol and a seal. One specific medkit type, found in a specific location in one zone, has something extra. Inside the flap, visible if you're close enough to the item during the inspection, there is a small label of the kind medical facilities attached to equipment to track it. The label has a name on it. The name is not the name of any playable character or any NPC with dialogue, but the name matches the name referenced in a piece of environmental text in a different part of the same zone, a handwritten note on a wall in the zone's medical area that mentions a specific person in connection with medical supplies. The medkit was issued to this person. It did not go where they were going. It ended up here. The 94th Easter egg is a tally. On one specific sniper rifle that players can find in the game, scratched into the stock with what appears to be a knife or a nail, there are tally marks. The marks are grouped in the standard 5-bar tally format. Players have counted them. There are 47 marks scratched by hand into the stock of a rifle. Each mark in the context of a sniper rifle has an obvious potential meaning. What these 47 marks represent is never explained. The number 47 itself is not notable in any known Ark Raiders lore context. It is simply their 47 marks on a gun someone carried and used and kept count with. The 95th Easter egg connects a weapon to a person in a very direct way. One specific weapon has a worn tag hanging from the trigger guard, the kind of paper tag that would be attached to an item submitted for repair or storage. The text on the tag includes a name and a short notation. The name on the tag appears in the environmental text of the zone where this weapon is found, in a different context as part of a longer written document describing a person and their role in a pre-ark organization. The notation on the tag, a brief descriptor, matches the role described in the environmental text. This weapon belonged to a specific person who existed in the world of Ark Raiders before the events of the game, whose name is documented in environmental text, and whose weapon ended up in a specific location that players can reach. The connection between the weapon and the person is made through nothing more than a worn paper tag, legible if you look. The 96th Easter egg is a radio in a kit. In the game's standard supply kit loadout, there is a radio. The radio is noted in the kit's item list and has a standard appearance. But under specific conditions, which players have documented as involving the kit being found in a specific type of location rather than the standard spawn locations, the radio in the kit is active and playing audio. The audio it plays is not the standard emergency broadcast. It is different, quieter, less structured, and less clearly intentional in the way broadcasts tend to be. Players who have recorded and analysed it describe it as a personal transmission, the kind of audio that sounds like one person speaking to another rather than a formatted broadcast, though the audio quality is too degraded to make out specific words. Where this transmission is coming from and when it was made is not something the game addresses. The 97th Easter egg is a canteen. Among the personal items found in the game's environments, canteens are common and generally unremarkable. But one specific canteen, found in a very specific location in one zone, has engraving on its side. The engraving is in a language other than English. Players who know the language in question have translated it as a short phrase that functions as a kind of personal motto or statement of commitment. The language the engraving is in is a real human language, not a fictional one, and its presence in this game raises a quiet question about where this person came from, that they carried a canteen engraved in this language in a world whose visual language is otherwise primarily English. The canteen belongs to someone whose story the game does not tell, but whose presence in this world it acknowledges with a single engraved line. The 98th Easter egg is a standard kit with a non-standard item. Ark Raiders uses consistent kit compositions for most of its standard equipment loadouts, which makes this Easter egg visible only to players who have examined enough kits to know what the standard composition looks like. One specific kit found in one specific location contains the standard items in the standard positions, but also contains one additional item that is not part of the standard kit. The item is small and personal in nature, not a practical survival item, but a personal object of a kind you would carry because it matters to you rather than because it helps you survive. Its presence in a standard kit means someone packed it themselves, overriding the standard loadout to include something that the survival protocols would not have included. Whatever that item meant to the person who put it there, it mattered enough to carry. The weapon and gear Easter eggs collectively build a portrait of a world where objects have histories that outlast their owners. Every engraved name and every modification tag and every tally mark on a rifle stock is a trace of a person who is no longer here. The weapons have passed through hands that can no longer hold them. The medkits were issued to patients who never received treatment. The backpack was packed for a journey the packer never completed. Ark Raiders uses its inventory items not just as tools, but as relics, objects that carry the residue of the people who owned them, waiting to be recognized by someone who is looking carefully enough to notice. Chapter 8. Voices in the Dark, NPC and Dialogue. Easter eggs, NPCs in Ark Raiders are, for the most part, functional. They give you missions, they sell you things, they tell you lore when you ask for it. But embedded in their dialogue and their behaviour are 14 Easter eggs that reward players who pay very close attention to what these characters say and how they say it. Some of these eggs require specific conditions to trigger. Some are always there, but easy to miss. All of them add something to the texture of the game's world. The 99th Easter egg is something an NPC says about an event that should not exist in the game's documented history. During extended interaction with a specific mission-giving character, under certain dialogue conditions that players have mapped through extensive experimentation, this character makes a brief reference to an event using language that implies they have first-hand knowledge of it. The event they reference is not documented in any accessible lore in the game. It is not mentioned in any environmental text, any mission briefing, any flavor text. It is referenced only in this one dialogue line, spoken by this one character, under specific triggering conditions that most players never encounter. The reference is casual, almost offhand. The way you mention something obvious to someone you assume already knows. The character is not flagging this as significant. They seem to assume you know what they are talking about. The player almost certainly does not. The 100th Easter egg is about dialogue that changes based on mission completion. Most games have some version of this mechanic, where NPC dialogue updates to reflect completed objectives. But Ark Raiders has one specific NPC, whose dialogue changes in a way that goes beyond standard mission acknowledgement. When players have completed a specific sequence of missions in a specific order, this NPC's general ambient dialogue, the things they say when you pass near them without engaging them directly, shifts significantly. The new ambient dialogue references events that the player's missions appear to have set in motion, events happening off-screen that the NPC has apparently become aware of. These references suggest that the game has a running simulation of off-screen world events that NPCs are responding to, and that completing missions in the right order surfaces that simulation in this character's dialogue. The 101st Easter egg is a character who reacts differently based on what you're carrying. In one of the underground community spaces, a specific NPC appears to notice certain items in your loadout. Under specific conditions, when you approach this character while carrying specific items, they initiate dialogue that they do not initiate otherwise. The dialogue is not mission-related, it is personal, specific to the items you are carrying, and it reveals something about this character's own history in relation to those items. Players have catalogued which items trigger which dialogue responses, and the map of their findings suggests this character has a detailed personal history involving specific types of equipment, locations, and events. Most players walk past this character every run without knowing that what they're carrying determines whether they ever hear any of this. The 102nd Easter egg connects an NPC to a name found in environmental text. In one zone's readable environmental text, a name appears in what appears to be a personnel roster or a community record. The same name is the name of a living NPC in the game's underground community. This would not be unusual, except that the environmental text where the name appears is from a period that predates the current Raider community by what the game implies is a significant number of years. The NPC is clearly present in the current game world and appears to be a functioning adult, not an elderly person. If the name in the environmental text is the same person as the current NPC, and the game does seem to suggest this through other connecting details, then this character is significantly older than they appear. No in-game dialogue ever addresses this. The 103rd Easter egg is a vendor who changes languages. In one of the trading areas in the underground community spaces, a vendor character, who speaks in the game's primary language occasionally and briefly, slips into a different language when certain dialogue conditions are met. The language they slip into is a real human language, recognizable to native speakers. The specific phrases they use in the second language have been translated by community members who know the language, and the translations are meaningful rather than random. The content of what the vendor says in their second language is, in at least one case, a direct but subtle contradiction of something they say in the primary language in the same conversation. The vendor is saying two different things about the same subject, depending on which language they are using. The 104th Easter egg is about an NPC who references the game's earliest version. Ark Raiders went through a public testing period before its current release, and during that period, the game included content and lore that was later changed or removed. One specific NPC in the current game version has a dialogue line that references something from that early version, something that no longer exists in the game, but that players who participated in early testing would recognize. The reference is indirect enough that it functions as flavor text for players who do not know the history. But for players who were there during early testing, the reference is clearly specific and clearly intentional, a nod from the developers to the community that was there at the beginning. The 105th Easter egg is an NPC who appears in two places. During normal runs, players encounter a specific NPC type in the underground community spaces. This character has a consistent appearance and consistent base dialogue. But players who have run enough maps have documented what appears to be the same character, with the same name and the same distinctive physical design elements, appearing in a completely different zone in a completely different context. Not in an underground community space, but on the surface, in the danger zone, in a non-combat role. The character's dialogue in the second location is completely different from their dialogue in the community space. Whether this is two different characters who look identical, one character who moves between locations in ways the game does not explain, or a continuity oversight by the developers, is genuinely unclear. The 106th Easter egg is about how one character describes the Ark machines. Every faction in Ark Raiders has an official position on what the Ark machines are, where they came from, and how they should be dealt with. The official positions are consistent within each faction, coherent and clearly documented in mission briefings and lore text. But one NPC in the game characterizes the Ark machines in terms that do not match any faction's official position. This character describes Ark behavior in ways that suggest observation over an extended period, a nuanced reading of Ark machine behavior that goes beyond what any official faction has documented. The character uses language that suggests they have been watching the machines closely for a long time and drawing conclusions that the factions either haven't reached or have reached and are not sharing. The 107th Easter egg connects a living character to an old recording. In one of the zones, players can find an audio recording device, either a cassette player or a reel-to-reel unit, depending on which zone. The recording on the device, still playable, captures a voice. The voice is giving information, describing a location, outlining a plan, speaking to someone who is not on the recording. Players who have compared this voice to the NPC cast of the game have noted that it appears to match, in timbre and in speech cadence, the voice of a specific living NPC in the underground community. If the recording predates the Ark arrival, as its context suggests, then this NPC's voice was recorded in the world before the invasion. The NPC is still here, still alive, and has never mentioned this recording in any of their accessible dialogue. The 108th Easter egg is about an NPC who knows your character's name before you introduce yourself. Under specific conditions, during an early interaction with a particular character in the underground community, This character addresses your character by their call sign before any exchange in the current session would have given them this information. The game does not acknowledge this. The NPC moves immediately into their standard dialogue after the name drop, as if it is a normal thing to know. Players who have deliberately withheld their call sign from all accessible prior interactions to test whether there is a legitimate prior information pathway have confirmed that the character still knows the name. Where the character got this information is not addressed anywhere in the game. The 109th Easter egg is about a backstory contradiction. One playable character in Ark Raiders has an official biography that is accessible through the game's character selection or information systems. The biography gives a specific account of the character's history, where they were during the Ark arrival, what they did in the aftermath, how they ended up in the Raider community. But one NPC in the underground community, when given the right prompting through specific dialogue choices, gives an account of a past interaction with this same character that does not match the official biography. The NPC's account is specific, detailed, and delivered without any indication that the NPC is uncertain about what they're saying. Both accounts cannot be correct. Either the official biography is inaccurate, or the NPC is wrong, or both are partial accounts of a larger truth that neither fully captures. The 110th Easter egg is a conversation between NPCs that players are not supposed to be a direct participant in. In the underground community spaces, background NPC conversations happen continuously. Most of these conversations are generic ambient flavor, but one specific exchange between two named NPCs in a specific area, conducted at a volume low enough that players tend to tune it out as background noise, contains details that are not ambient flavor. The exchange references a specific trading operation, by name, involving specific goods, moving between specific locations in a way that sounds very much like an organized black market operation within the community. The names of the participants, the goods described, and the locations referenced are all specific and internally consistent. The exchange ends naturally when the two NPCs separate and return to their standard routes. No mission involves this trading operation. No other NPC references it. The 111th Easter egg is about inventory-based NPC reactions. In a different context from Easter egg 101, one NPC in the game reacts to an item in your inventory without you selecting it or presenting it. The reaction is a brief visual change in the character's animation state, a pause, a slight head orientation, before returning to their standard behavior. Players who have documented this report that it happens consistently when approaching this NPC with a specific item type in their loadout, and that the item type that triggers the reaction is one associated with a specific zone. The NPC reacts as if they recognize where you have been, based on something you are carrying, without acknowledging it in dialogue. Whatever connection this character has to that zone, they are not saying it out loud. The 112th Easter egg is a character who appears only once per playthrough and has dialogue containing a specific phrase that players have never found repeated anywhere else in the game. The character appears in a transitional zone space, not in the main community area and not on the surface, but in a connector space between them. They are present for a brief period and then gone. Not dead or departed in a dramatic way, simply no longer there the next time the player passes through the same space. Their dialogue, delivered in a single short speech, covers several topics. Most of it is generic, but one sentence contains a specific phrase that players have logged and that appears after extensive community effort to find it nowhere else in the game's accessible audio or text. The phrase sounds like it belongs to a larger context that the character is referencing but not explaining. It sounds like the middle of a much longer conversation that the player has joined briefly and unexpectedly and will never hear the rest of. The NPC dialogue. Easter eggs collectively suggest that Ark Raiders has been designed with significant depth below its surface narrative. The characters know things they do not say. They say things that contradict each other. They react to conditions that the game's official mechanics do not account for. They reference histories and events and operations that the player can never fully investigate. The game's NPCs inhabit a world that is more complicated than any single run or any single series of runs can fully reveal. They are not just quest dispensers or merchants. They are people with histories, with connections, with secrets, and with ongoing lives that the player intersects with only briefly. The Easter eggs in this chapter are the places where those lives briefly become visible. Chapter 9. Loading Screen and UI Secrets. The loading screen and user interface are not places most players look for Easter eggs. They are functional elements, ways of organizing information, and bridging between gameplay states. But Ark Raiders has embedded a number of deliberate hidden details in exactly these overlooked spaces, from loading screen art to UI element behaviors to map icon quirks. This chapter covers 14 of them. The 113th Easter egg is a loading screen that changes. Most loading screens in Ark Raiders are static, consistent images that players see briefly between zones. But one specific loading screen has been documented to change based on events from the player's previous session. Specifically, if certain conditions were met in the last session, the loading screen for the following session's opening zone displays a different version of its image. The difference is not dramatic, but it is consistent and documented. The most common variation involves a detail in the background of the image being present or absent depending on whether a specific in-game action was performed in the prior session. The game is tracking a past session variable and using it to modify a present session visual element, which is a level of dynamic detail in a loading screen that most players would never think to look for. The 114th Easter egg is a UI element that appears under specific circumstances. During the execution of one specific type of in-game action, players who have recorded their sessions and reviewed the footage frame by frame have documented a UI element appearing very briefly that does not appear under normal circumstances. The element appears for approximately 2 to 4 frames, which is too fast to perceive in real-time gameplay. The element has a specific shape and contains what appear to be numerical values. The numbers in the brief element are consistent across observations by different players performing the same action, which rules out a random UI artifact. What the element is displaying and what the numbers represent has not been determined, though players have proposed several interpretations based on the context of the action that triggers it. The 115th Easter egg is about map icons. The game's zone map uses icons to indicate various points of interest, extraction points, resource locations, and other markers. Players who have observed these icons across different in-game times of day have noted that several of them subtly change shape depending on the time of day in the game world. The change is not a dramatic animation. It is a slight shift in the icon's outline that gives it a different character at different times. The specific icons that show this behavior are not the ones associated with time-sensitive gameplay elements, which would make the time of day change functionally significant. The icons that change are for fixed location static features whose properties do not actually change with time of day. The icon change is therefore purely aesthetic and informational, though what information it is conveying is not explained anywhere in the game. The 116th Easter egg is in the mission briefings. Mission briefings in Ark Raiders are presented in both audio and text format, with the mission giver's voice reading the briefing while text appears on screen. In almost all cases, the text matches the spoken audio exactly, but in one specific mission, players who have carefully compared the spoken briefing to the on-screen text have found a single sentence that appears in the text but is not spoken aloud. The sentence is not highlighted or distinguished in any way. It appears in the text in the same format as the surrounding sentences, but the voice actor does not read it. The sentence in question contains specific information relevant to the mission's context that the spoken briefing does not include. It is legible, it is there, and it is only findable by a player who reads the mission text carefully, rather than relying on the spoken version. The 117th Easter egg is in the loading screen artwork. Several of the loading screens feature detailed artwork depicting scenes or environments. In one specific loading screen, background elements have been identified by players as containing a figure that is not immediately obvious in the composition. The figure is positioned in a part of the background that draws the eye away from it, placed within a section of the image that reads as environmental detail rather than a character. Once pointed out, the figure is clearly there and clearly intentional. Its positioning relative to the foreground elements of the image gives it a specific relationship to the main subject matter of the loading screen art that appears meaningful. The figure appears to be observing the main subject of the image from a distance, unseen by the other figures in the composition. The 118th Easter egg is a single frame icon variant. The inventory icon for one of the game's common items is consistent across all appearances of that item, except for one specific instance. Players who have recorded extended inventory sessions have documented a single frame in which the icon for this item appears with a different image. The different image lasts for one frame and then returns to the standard icon. The alternate image is not the standard icon slightly varied. It is a completely different image, showing something that players have described as architectural in nature, resembling a structure rather than the inventory item the icon is supposed to represent. The single frame alternate has been confirmed by multiple players in recorded footage, and its content is consistent enough across observers to rule out compression artifacts or recording anomalies. The 119th Easter egg is a progress bar. One of the game's loading or progress bars passes through the 50% mark in its fill animation. Players who have watched this bar carefully, or who have recorded and reviewed it, have documented that at the exact 50% mark, the bar briefly changes colour before continuing to fill in its standard colour. The colour change lasts a very short time, short enough to be subliminal in real-time viewing. The colour it changes to is specific and distinct from both the standard fill colour and the background colour of the bar. The same colour appears elsewhere in the game's UI in a different context, associated with a specific type of notification. Whether this fleeting colour change is meant to communicate something, or whether it is a rendering artifact from how the bar animation is constructed, has not been determined. The 120th Easter egg is a one-time notification. Early in a player's first playthrough, before significant progression, the game sends one specific UI notification that has never been reproduced after that initial appearance. Players who received this notification early in their experience have described it as unlike any standard notification format used elsewhere in the game. It uses a slightly different visual presentation, appears in a position on screen that differs from the standard notification position, and contains text that does not match any standard notification category. Players who did not record their early sessions have no way to go back and capture it. Players who are not paying attention to their UI in those early moments missed it. The content of the notification has been assembled from the descriptions of players who did see it, and the assembled content is specific enough that it reads as a lore statement rather than a tutorial prompt. The 121st Easter egg is about the main menu background. The main menu of Ark Raiders displays a visual background. Like many games, this background is not static and changes over time, but the rate of change in Ark Raiders' main menu background is very slow, and the changes are subtle enough that most players do not notice them. Players who have taken regular screenshots of the main menu over extended periods have documented that the background image changes measurably over the course of weeks of real-world time. The changes are consistent in a specific direction. Objects in the image are in different positions over time. Something in the background image is moving slowly across the frame in real time at a pace that would require weeks of daily observation to notice. What is moving and what it will look like when it has completed its movement is something the community is still tracking. The 120-second Easter egg is a map marker that flickers. In certain run sessions, one specific map marker associated with a fixed location in one zone briefly indicates a different location before settling back to its standard position. The flicker is brief, 1 to 2 seconds, and the alternate position the marker briefly indicates is a specific location rather than a random point on the map. Players who have noted the alternate position and navigated to it during the same session have reported finding the location visually unremarkable, no different from surrounding terrain. But a small number of players have reported that the location is different on sessions where the marker flickered versus sessions where it did not. The difference, when described, involves a small environmental detail at the location being present or absent. Whether this is a deliberate mechanic or a display error remains unresolved. The 123rd Easter egg is an achievement icon. Among the game's achievement images, one specific achievement has an icon that contains a small symbol embedded within the main imagery of the icon. The symbol is small enough that it is not immediately visible at the standard display size of achievement icons. Players who have examined the icon at enlarged scale have documented the symbol and compared it to the symbol catalogs assembled for other Easter eggs in the game. The achievement icon symbol matches, at sufficient similarity to be notable, one of the faction-neutral floor symbols discussed in Easter egg 41. The same symbol appears in the environmental floor markings and in the achievement icon. Whether the developers use the same asset in both contexts, or whether the similarity is deliberate and meaningful, is not clear. The 124th Easter egg is about the compass. The game's directional compass is a standard navigational UI element, but players who have systematically rotated their orientation through a full 360-degree sweep have found that at one specific orientation, the compass icon briefly displays a different symbol. The alternate symbol appears only when the player is oriented in a specific compass direction, roughly equivalent to a bearing that points toward one of the game's primary zone areas. The duration of the alternate symbol is short enough to be easy to miss, appearing for a fraction of a second as the player's orientation sweeps past the specific bearing. The alternate symbol is a simple geometric form, distinct from the standard compass icon, and its appearance at this specific directional orientation has been independently confirmed by enough players to rule out coincidence. The 125th Easter egg is about the health bar. The health bar in Ark Raiders displays the player's current health in a standard format, but players who have specifically observed the health bar animation at maximum health and at one point of health remaining have noted that the animation behaves differently at these two extremes. At maximum health, the bar's display is stable and consistent. At one point remaining, the bar's animation includes a very subtle pulsing variation that is not present at other health levels. The pulse rate corresponds to the average human resting heart rate range, roughly 60 to 80 beats per minute. The health bar is, at one point remaining, mimicking a heartbeat. This detail is not announced or highlighted anywhere in the game's documentation. It is simply there, for the player who is at one health point and paying attention to the edge of their screen rather than what is trying to kill them. The 126th Easter egg is about the mission timer. In missions with time limits, the countdown timer reaches midnight in-game time at specific points in certain runs. Players who have carefully observed the timer behavior at exactly midnight in-game time have documented a brief anomaly. At exactly midnight, the timer appears to reset 1 second early. The timer shows a value, then shows a value 1 second lower before the expected interval, then continues from there at the correct rate. This 1 second early reset at midnight in-game time is consistent across multiple observations. It is a small discrepancy, 1 second, and it has no gameplay consequence. But it happens at midnight every time, and only at midnight, which makes it difficult to explain as a random timer error. The in-game midnight appears to be significant to the timer's code in a way that is not explained by any accessible game documentation. The UI Easter eggs collectively suggest that Ark Raiders is paying attention to its own interface in ways that most games do not. The interface is not just a functional overlay on top of the game. It is itself a layer of the game's design, with its own hidden content, its own dynamic behaviors, and its own small surprises embedded in places where players are least likely to look. The single-frame icon variant, the 2 to 4 frame UI element, the 1 second early timer reset, all of these are details operating at a timescale smaller than human perception in normal use. They are there for the player who slows down, who records and reviews, who pays attention to the framing around the game rather than just the game itself. Ark Raiders, as a design object, has edges worth examining. Chapter 10. Before the Fall, Pre-ark World Easter Eggs. One of the things Ark Raiders does particularly well is world building through the ruins of the civilization that existed before the Ark machines arrived. The pre-ark world is not shown directly. It is reconstructed through the things it left behind. This chapter focuses on 14 Easter eggs embedded specifically in the pre-ark material culture of the game, details that tell you about the world as it was before everything changed. The 127th Easter egg is about newspapers and calendars. Readable text in Ark Raiders is sparse but deliberate. The newspapers and printed materials visible in the game's environments are not clearly readable, but have discernible headlines in some cases, and the dates on calendars, as previously discussed, tell a specific story. But the newspapers add another dimension. The visual layout of the newspaper front pages that players have examined at close range follows a design tradition that places them in a specific period, suggesting a world slightly more advanced than ours in some respects, but using media formats familiar from the late print era of journalism. The headlines, while not fully readable, have a length and apparent structure consistent with news stories about significant but not catastrophic events, normal world news, political and economic and local, from a period before anyone knew what was coming. The 128th Easter egg is about the technology level of the pre-ark world. Ark Raiders' ruined environments contain consumer technology from the pre-ark era. Players who have paid careful attention to the design language of this technology have noted that it is slightly ahead of current real-world technology in some respects. Specifically, several consumer device designs visible in the environments suggest a level of miniaturization and integration that our own world was approaching but had not fully achieved at the point when Ark Raiders was developed. Whether this is intentional world building to signal a near-future setting or simply the developers drawing on design trends that were emerging during the game's production is unclear, but the technology in the ruins of Ark Raiders is not quite the technology of the current real world. It is one step further. The 129th Easter egg is about fashion. The clothing and design details visible on mannequins in retail spaces, in photographs found in environments, and on figures depicted in pre-ark artwork and advertising materials follow fashion trends that are close to, but not identical to, real-world contemporary fashion. Several specific details in cut, in material, in accessory design suggest a fashion language that diverged from ours at some point. The designers appear to have deliberately made the pre-ark world's fashion slightly different from our own. This is consistent with the slightly advanced technology level and the near but not identical brand names. Ark Raiders Pre-ark world is not our world. It is a version of it that went a slightly different direction and ended up in a somewhat different place. The 130th Easter egg is a pre-ark advertisement that seems, in retrospect, to be addressing something related to the Ark threat. In one zone's commercial district, a partially visible billboard advertisement for a consumer product features a tagline that, read in the context of an Ark-invaded world, has a different meaning than it would have had at the time of posting. The tagline is optimistic and forward-looking, as commercial advertising tends to be, but the specific language it uses about protection, resilience, and coming through challenges unchanged reads very differently now than it would have on the day the ad was posted. Whether the developers deliberately chose this language for ironic resonance, or whether the advertising copy is genuine pre-ark invasion consumer language that happens to resonate differently in this context, is hard to determine. But the resonance is there. The 131st Easter egg is a university. In one zone, a university campus is partially accessible. The university has multiple departments visible, and the department names and research area descriptions visible on their building facades and directory boards are readable in part. Among the departments listed is one that deals with research areas that, in the context of Ark Raiders lore, are directly relevant to understanding Ark machine technology. The specific research areas described for this department use terminology from physics, materials science, and autonomous systems engineering that would make it the department most equipped to study and understand Ark machines, if Ark machines were something that existed in the pre-ark world. Either this department was built for reasons unrelated to the Ark threat and happened to be relevant to it after the fact, or the pre-ark world had some awareness, at least in research terms, of what was coming. The 132nd Easter egg involves a pre-ark news ticker visible on a dead television screen in one zone. The television is not playing video, but its last displayed frame is frozen on the screen, including a scrolling news ticker at the bottom of the image. Players who have gotten close enough to the screen to read the ticker have documented partial text that appears to be headlines from a news broadcast. The content of the headlines, though fragmentary, suggests a political and international landscape with significant tensions. The specific issues referenced in the ticker are not identical to any current real-world political situation, but rhyme with them in ways that have been noted by players who are paying attention to the world-building context. The pre-ark world had problems. The specific problems it had matter for understanding why the Ark arrival was able to affect it the way it did. The 133rd Easter egg is a children's book. In several of the game's residential environments, children's books are visible on shelves and on floors. Most are too small to read, but one specific children's book, found on a child's bed in a residential zone, is positioned open and is readable at close range. The story in this book, read across its visible pages, involves a small creature who is visited by large strangers who come from far away and change the creature's home. The small creature has to learn to live in a changed world. The story is written and illustrated in the style of children's literature and is not graphic or frightening. It is a child's story with the appropriate emotional register. But its premise, visitors from far away changing the world of the small creature who lives there, mirrors the Ark Raiders premise closely enough that it is difficult not to read it as intentional. A children's story about the end of the world, told in a way children could understand. The 134th Easter egg is a board game. In one of the residential zone living rooms, a board game is set up on a table. The game appears to have been mid-play when it was abandoned. Board games in games always invite reading. This one has a visible board layout, game pieces in positions suggesting active play, and a box visible enough for the title to be partially readable. The title and the board design suggest a strategy game with a mechanical theme, one involving control of resources and territory against an opposing force that threatens the player's established position. The game's rules summary, partially visible on a reference card beside the board, uses language about managing defences, containing incursions, and maintaining operational stability. It is, as games of its type tend to be, an abstracted version of a conflict that shares basic structural similarities with the Ark invasion. Whether this makes it an Easter egg or a coincidence is something each player gets to decide. The 135th Easter egg is a film poster. In the remains of the movie theatre discussed in Chapter 1, and in other entertainment venues throughout the zones, film posters are visible on walls and in display cases. Most of them are generic, but one specific poster, for a film whose title and imagery are clearly visible, depicts a story about robotic entities from beyond Earth encountering human civilization. The poster uses the visual language of action film marketing, and the robotic entities it depicts do not look like Ark machines. But the thematic match to the game's central premise is close enough to be notable. The film poster suggests that, in the pre-Ark world of Ark Raiders, the idea of robotic invaders from space was popular entertainment, a science fiction concept, a thing people made movies about. Then the movies became reality. The 136th Easter egg is a company logo. Throughout the pre-Ark ruins, one specific company's branding appears repeatedly, on product packaging, on building signage, on vehicle livery, and on equipment in certain facilities. The company appears to have been large and diverse in its operations. Players who have catalogued all appearances of this logo have noted something interesting about its design. The logo, when rotated 90 degrees and viewed at a specific orientation, has a silhouette that closely resembles the profile of one of the Ark machine types. Not identical, not a perfect match, but close enough to the Ark machine's silhouette that the comparison is uncomfortable to dismiss. Whether the company that made this logo had some connection to the Ark machines, or whether this is a visual coincidence by the design team, is one of the more open questions among players who have noticed it. The 137th Easter egg is about electronics. The consumer electronics in Ark Raiders' pre-Ark ruins are slightly more advanced than our own, as noted in Easter egg 128. But there is one specific category of consumer electronics where the advancement is more dramatic than in others. The pre-Ark world's personal communication devices, visible in homes and offices and retail spaces, show a level of integration and miniaturization that represents a significant step beyond current real-world technology. Specifically, the devices appear to be capable of environmental interaction, not just personal communication. The design language of these devices suggests functionality beyond simple communication and display. Whether this implies that the pre-Ark world had developed a degree of ambient computing integration that our world has not yet achieved, and what that might imply about the Ark machine's ability to interface with human systems, is left entirely to the player's interpretation. The 138th Easter egg is a military testing facility. Accessible in one of the zones, a military or paramilitary facility predates the Ark invasion and shows evidence of specific research activity. The research documentation visible in the facility, through observation of pinned documents, wall charts, and terminal screens, references protocols and procedures that are clearly designed for responding to a specific type of threat. The threat type described in the protocols matches several characteristics of Ark machine behavior. The facility appears to have been testing responses to an entity type that shares characteristics with the Ark machines prior to the Ark arrival being a public event. What this means, whether the pre-Ark military had foreknowledge of the Ark threat, whether this was simply contingency planning for hypothetical threats, or whether something else was being studied, is not answered by the facility's visible contents. The 139th Easter egg is in a museum. In one zone, a cultural institution, identifiable as a museum based on its layout and signage, is accessible. Inside the museum, the exhibits visible to players include a large-scale sculptural work in the main gallery. The sculpture is abstract in its formal qualities, non-representational in the conventional sense, but its overall shape and the arrangement of its component elements closely resemble the configuration of a specific Ark machine type. The museum's exhibit label, partially readable, identifies the work as being from a period before the Ark invasion and describes the sculptor's stated intention in language that references concepts of organized movement, distributed form, and emergent pattern. The sculpture was made before the Ark machines existed in the world by an artist who said they were interested in organized movement and emergent pattern, and it looks like one of them. The 140th Easter egg is a scientific journal. In a crashed or overturned vehicle in one zone, visible through the cracked windshield or through an open door, a scientific journal publication is lying open. The journal is too small and at the wrong angle to read in full, but players who have positioned their camera carefully have documented partial text. The visible text references an orbital anomaly, a discrepancy between expected and observed data for a specific region of space. The language used is the careful, hedged language of academic scientific writing. The anomaly being described, based on the partial text that is readable, appears to be something in an orbit that was not there before, something that was not accounted for in prior observation data. This journal was written before anyone knew what the Ark machines were. The anomaly it describes in an orbit sounds like exactly what it turned out to be. The pre-Ark Easter eggs collectively suggest that the world of Ark raiders was not as unaware of what was coming as the immediate post-invasion chaos would imply. The children's book had a story about visitors from far away. The university had a department studying exactly the relevant science. The military facility had protocols for a threat type matching Ark behavior. The scientific journal had documented an anomaly in orbit. The film poster had imagined robotic invaders for entertainment. The corporation's logo looked like an Ark machine from a certain angle. Whether these connections point to foreknowledge or coincidence, or the developers embedding their own thematic consistency into the world's texture, is genuinely up for debate. But the connections are there. The pre-Ark world in Ark Raiders knew something. Maybe not enough, maybe too late, but something. Chapter 11. The Origin Question. Ark Machine Lore. Clues of all the questions that Ark Raiders raises and does not directly answer, the most fundamental is the simplest. What are the Ark machines, and where do they actually come from? The game's official framing treats them as extraterrestrial machinery, invaders from beyond Earth. But embedded throughout the game are 14 Easter eggs that complicate this framing significantly. This chapter is about those complications. The 141st Easter egg is one of the most discussed in the Ark Raiders community. Among the Ark machines in the game, specifically among the higher-tier Ark units that players encounter in more difficult zones, there are instances where the machine appears to be carrying or incorporated with an object that does not originate from Ark machine design. The object in question appears to be a human personal item, specifically the type of personal item that a person might carry because of its sentimental value rather than its practical function. The object is attached to the Ark machine's chassis in a way that appears deliberate rather than incidental, secured rather than simply stuck. An Ark machine is carrying a human personal item, not a functional human component. A personal item. Why a machine from beyond Earth would be carrying a human personal item, and what the significance of the specific item type is not explained. The 142nd Easter egg is about the internal sounds of Ark machines. Earlier in the audio chapter, we discussed the external sounds that Ark machines produce and what they sound like when reversed and slowed. This Easter egg is distinct and involves the internal sounds audible when a player is in very close proximity to a damaged Ark unit that is still functioning. The damage that makes the internal sounds audible is specific, requiring the machine to be compromised in specific areas while remaining operational. Players who have positioned themselves to hear these internal sounds and recorded them have noted something that does not align with purely mechanical operation. The internal sounds include a rhythmic component that is not consistent with any mechanical cycling that the machine's visible design would produce. The rhythm is regular, repeating, and at a rate consistent with biological processes rather than mechanical ones. The 143rd Easter egg is behavioral and requires specific observation to document. When an Ark machine of a specific type is destroyed in proximity to other Ark machines of the same type, the surviving units exhibit a behavior that is not consistent with the tactical responses documented for Ark machine AI. The surviving machines, after the destruction event, briefly adopt a behavior that functions like no tactical advantage and that players have described using language borrowed from animal behavior science. The machines orient toward the destroyed unit, remain stationary for a brief period longer than tactical positioning would suggest, and then resume normal activity. The duration and consistency of this pause has been documented across enough observations that it appears to be a designed behavior rather than an AI artifact. Why machines from beyond Earth would have a designed behavioral response to the loss of a unit of their own type is a question that does not have a comfortable mechanical answer. The 144th Easter egg is about Ark command patterns. Players who have studied Ark machine tactical behavior over extended play sessions have noted that certain Ark unit formations and tactical responses mirror specific historical human military strategies. The Stalker unit's flanking behavior, discussed in Chapter 2, mirrors wolfpack movement, but the tactical command structure of larger Ark engagements involving multiple unit types coordinating against a player or group shows patterns consistent with specific documented human military doctrines.